The sun had just set, leaving behind the last streaks of orange across the sky. I sat by the edge of the campfire, the crackling of the wood the only sound breaking the night's silence. It had been a quiet afternoon, the kind of calm I was hoping for when I decided to take this solo camping trip. There was something therapeutic about being away from everything. Away from work, away from people, and away from the usual noise of life. This was the first time in a while I could just breathe, stretch out my thoughts, and let everything fade into the background. I had set up camp near a small, remote lake. The path leading to it had been long, and the trail was almost overgrown, as if nature had been trying to reclaim it. But that made it perfect for someone like me, who was seeking solitude. I hadn't seen a single person since the trailhead, and the only sounds around me were the rustling leaves and the occasional bird call. The lake, reflecting the deepening blue sky, seemed so serene. It was just me, my tent, and the crackling fire. As I poked the fire with a stick, the orange embers burst up into the night air, creating tiny sparks that scattered briefly before fading into the darkness. I tossed a few more logs on the fire, the smell of burning wood mixing with the fresh scent of pine. Everything felt right, peaceful. I wrapped myself in my jacket and leaned back against the log I had been sitting on, letting the warmth from the fire seep into my skin. There were no plans, no rush, just me and the wilderness. The wind picked up a bit, rustling the trees around me. I shivered slightly as the temperature dropped, but I wasn't worried. I had brought a heavy sleeping bag, and the fire would keep me warm enough for the night. As I stared at the flames, I found myself growing drowsy. It had been a long day of hiking, and despite the fact that I was alone in this vast stretch of forest, I didn't feel afraid. I was used to being out in the wilderness. This was my third solo camping trip, and nothing had ever gone wrong before. The worst thing I had experienced was a raccoon stealing my food. But as the minutes passed, something about the quietness of this place started to feel a little off. It was subtle at first, like a low hum in the back of my mind. There were no more animal sounds, no distant calls from birds or the occasional rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. It was as though the world around me had held its breath, waiting for something. I shook my head, dismissing the thought. It was just my mind playing tricks on me. The solitude was starting to get to me, that was all. I had a habit of overthinking when I was alone too long. But then, as I stared at the fire, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A twig snapped, somewhere just beyond the light of my campfire. My heart skipped a beat. I sat up straight, my eyes scanning the darkness around me. The wind had stopped completely, and everything was still. Too still. It was probably just an animal. There were plenty of small creatures in the woods, and the forest was full of life, even if I couldn't see it. Still, the snap of the twig had been too loud, too distinct. I tried to push the thought from my mind and focus on the fire, but my ears strained for any other sounds. Nothing came, just the steady, rhythmic crackling of the fire. Minutes passed. The fire continued to burn, and the woods stayed quiet. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer or a raccoon had wandered too close. I'd heard strange sounds like that before on camping trips, and they were always easily explained away. But then I heard it again, a faint rustling, followed by another sharp snap of a twig. This time it was closer, much closer. I froze, my blood running cold. My mind raced, running through possibilities. I knew there were bears in these woods, but they weren't usually this close to camp. I had hung my food in a tree, well away from the tent, just in case. Still, the idea of a bear wandering nearby made my skin crawl. The sound came again, and this time it was unmistakable. A soft shuffle, like footsteps. Someone, or something, was moving through the forest near my camp. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up as my heart pounded in my chest. Whoever or whatever was out there, I wasn't alone. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands shaking as I clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the dark, revealing the forest around me, but nothing stood out. The trees, the underbrush, everything seemed normal. I could hear the faint sound of my own breathing as I scanned the area. But there was no one there, no animal, no figure, just the dark, silent trees. I slowly stood up, keeping my eyes fixed on the shadows just beyond the light. My body felt tense, my muscles tight as I clutched the flashlight in one hand, a heavy stick in the other. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but I wasn't taking any chances. Whatever had been out there, I wasn't going to be caught off guard. Minutes ticked by, and I stood motionless by the fire, the light of the flames flickering across the trees. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd heard. Maybe it was just a deer. Maybe it was just the wind again, playing tricks on me. I wasn't sure. But then, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were clearer, closer. Whoever or whatever was out there was moving toward me. The sound was deliberate, too precise to be an animal. I could hear it moving through the brush, the faint rustle of leaves and the soft snap of twigs underfoot. I spun around, my flashlight casting erratic beams across the forest, but I saw nothing. There was nothing there, nothing I could point to. My heart pounded in my chest as panic began to settle in. I tried to steady my breath, telling myself it was nothing, that it was just the wind or some other natural explanation. But something deep inside me told me that wasn't the case. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing, just the eerie silence of the night. My breath came out in shallow gasps as I stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. I kept the light trained on the trees, my eyes scanning the shadows. I had no idea who or what was out there, but I knew I couldn't stay where I was. The unease that had been creeping up on me all night was now a heavy weight in my stomach. It wasn't just a bear. It wasn't just an animal. This felt different. I took a slow step back toward my tent, my eyes never leaving the darkness beyond the fire. Every rustle, every shift in the wind made me jump. I wasn't sure if I was imagining things, but the feeling of being watched, of being hunted, was suffocating. I wasn't alone out here. That much was clear. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something, a shadow moving between the trees, just beyond the range of my flashlight. My breath caught in my throat. The shadow was tall, slender, and moving with purpose. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It was real. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of a figure slipping between the trees. My heart hammered in my chest as I quickly ducked down behind a large boulder near the fire. I had no idea what it was, but it was too big, too deliberate to be some random animal. The silence stretched on, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. It grew stronger, more oppressive. Whoever or whatever it was still out there, just out of sight, waiting. I tried to calm myself, to think. Should I leave? Should I pack up and hike back to the trailhead, where I might be able to find help? The thought of running in the dark, of stumbling through the woods, made my stomach churn. But staying wasn't an option either. I didn't know what I was dealing with, but I wasn't going to wait around to find out. I grabbed my things, my backpack, my sleeping bag, and shoved them into the tent. I didn't bother folding anything properly. I just needed to move. But as I hurriedly packed up, the footsteps returned. Slow, deliberate, moving toward me. I froze. My body was on alert. Every muscle tensed as I waited for the next sound. My heart pounded so loud in my ears, I was sure it would give me away. The footsteps stopped. There was no sound now, just the quiet hum of the night. Then the voice came. It was faint, barely a whisper carried on the wind. "You shouldn't be here." I didn't know what to do. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew they were close, too close. I backed away from the voice, my hands shaking. My body screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The words echoed in my head. I was alone, but I wasn't alone. I took a deep breath and sprinted. I didn't know where I was going, but I needed to get away. I wasn't sure how far I ran, how long I stumbled through the trees, until I finally broke into the open. My eyes blurred with tears as I gasped for breath, my body shaking from the rush of adrenaline. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead. The familiar sign of the path back to civilization was a relief, but I didn't look back. Not once. The next day, I went back to the site with a park ranger. My camp was untouched, the fire long gone cold. There were no signs of anything out of the ordinary. No footprints, no broken branches. It's late September, and I've always been the kind of person who enjoys the quiet of the woods. Something about the peaceful rustling of the leaves, the chirping of birds in the early hours, and the deep silence at night brings a kind of clarity I can't quite explain. So, when I found a small, somewhat remote campsite along the edge of a national forest, I didn't hesitate to book a few days to myself. I wanted a break from everything, the noise, the rush, the constant pressure to be somewhere, do something. The sun had already dipped below the horizon by the time I got to the site, leaving the sky a bruised purple with streaks of orange. My car bounced over the narrow dirt road that led to the small clearing where I'd be camping. I had planned to set up my tent and cook a simple meal over the fire before getting an early night's rest. But the moment I stepped out of the car, I felt the weight of the isolation in a way that I hadn't expected. The trees surrounding the campsite were tall and close together, their thick trunks blocking out any remaining light from the setting sun. The only illumination came from the faint glow of my headlights, casting long shadows across the ground. I pulled my backpack from the trunk, the familiar weight of it grounding me as I began to unpack. The area looked perfect for camping. There was a small fire pit in the middle of the clearing, surrounded by logs that served as makeshift seating. The ground was firm and dry, and there were a few small, scattered rocks that could be used to build a stable fire ring. It looked exactly how I'd imagined when I'd seen it listed online. A little piece of the wilderness, untouched and serene. As I got the fire started, I realized how silent it was. Not even the usual rustle of smaller animals in the underbrush. No breeze, no distant hum of traffic or human noise, just stillness. At first, I thought it was peaceful, but as I began to prepare my meal, simple, just some beans and rice, I started to feel a bit uneasy. There was no sound. Not a single thing stirred in the forest around me. It made the air feel thick, somehow oppressive. I shrugged it off. It was probably just the late hour, the time of day when even the animals seemed to settle down. I ate quickly, washing my dish with some water from my bottle, and then leaned back against a tree, letting the warmth from the fire soak into my skin. As the fire crackled, I glanced around again, the feeling of quiet still gnawing at me. I felt like I was being watched. It was irrational, I knew. The woods were full of creatures, big and small, and they were often more curious than anything. But the stillness, that deep, uninterrupted silence, was unnatural. As I sat there, trying to convince myself I was being silly, I thought I heard something. It was faint, almost like the sound of a footstep in the leaves, but it was so quiet I wasn't sure. My heart started to beat a little faster as I stared into the shadows, waiting for any sign that I had imagined it. But there was nothing, just the wind picking up a little, sending a few dry leaves spinning across the ground. I shook my head. I was being paranoid. But then it came again. A soft crunching sound from the underbrush, closer this time. Not far, maybe 30 feet away, just beyond the edge of the fire's light. I stood up, my pulse quickening. I knew it wasn't an animal. The sound was too deliberate, too human. Something wasn't right. My eyes swept the dark outline of the trees, trying to make out any movement. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, the beam of light slicing through the darkness, but there was nothing there. No sign of anything moving. I stood frozen, the beam trembling in my hand, every nerve in my body on edge. I convinced myself it was just a trick of the mind. Maybe some animals moving about, maybe the wind carrying something from further off. I turned back to the fire, trying to settle myself. But then I noticed something strange. The fire had dimmed, just a little, but enough for me to see the edges of the clearing clearly again. The shadows seemed deeper than before, almost like they were creeping closer. I threw another log on the fire, the crackling sound filling the silence as the flames roared back to life. But as I stood there, looking around, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. I kept scanning the trees, the underbrush, the long stretches of shadow in between. My heart was pounding in my chest now, but there was nothing I could see, at least. I sat back down, wiping my palms on my pants. I needed to calm down. I was just imagining things. I was being silly. But then, from behind me, I heard it again. A soft crack, like something heavy stepping on a twig. I froze, not daring to move. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. This was deliberate. Someone was out there. The sound came closer. This time, I didn't wait. I stood up and spun around, shining the flashlight through the trees. My beam swept over the forest, over the thick, dark trunks. But there was no one there. No movement. My mind raced. I thought about leaving. I thought about jumping in my car and speeding back to civilization. But I was far from the nearest town, and the road back was narrow and winding, especially at night. My only option was to stay put, hoping whatever it was would just go away. I kept my eyes on the trees, my flashlight darting back and forth across the dark expanse. My heartbeat was loud in my ears, drowning out everything else. The fire crackled behind me, but it sounded distant now, muted. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting just outside the light. Minutes stretched on like hours. I stayed in place, barely moving, straining my eyes against the dark. The night was still, too still. I could feel it now, something watching me, lurking in the shadows. The oppressive silence was almost unbearable, and I could swear the darkness had grown deeper, swallowing the light. Then it happened. From the trees ahead of me, a figure stepped out into the clearing. I froze, the beam of my flashlight blindingly bright against the dark outline. I could only make out the vague shape of a person, tall, thin, their face hidden in the shadows. I couldn't make out any details, but the way they stood there, motionless, sent a jolt of terror through me. My mouth went dry. I opened my mouth to shout, but no sound came out. For what felt like an eternity, neither of us moved. The figure just stood there, watching me. I could feel the air thickening between us, suffocating. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the figure stepped back into the trees, vanishing without a sound. I couldn't breathe for a moment. I stood there, heart racing, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. The stillness returned, even deeper than before. I don't know how long I stood there, my mind spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But eventually, the fog cleared, and my instincts took over. I grabbed my pack and started to pack up. I wasn't staying here any longer. Not for one more minute. I left the campsite as quickly as I could, not bothering to extinguish the fire properly. I just grabbed everything I could carry and made my way to the car. The drive out of the woods was nerve-wracking, every shadow along the side of the road seeming to hide something just out of sight. It was only when I was back on the main road, the familiar hum of the tires on the asphalt under me, that I finally allowed myself to relax, but only a little. I still didn't know what had happened back there, who or what that person or whatever it was had been. I never went back to that campsite, and though the experience haunted me for days after, the clarity I was seeking came to me in an unexpected way. I realized that not every corner of the world is meant to be explored, and sometimes the quietest places are the most unsettling. When I got home, I told myself it was probably nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe a wanderer in the woods. But deep down, I knew what I had felt. It was real. Something had been out there watching me, and I would never forget it. I took a week off from work in August of 2022. I was working at a warehouse job in Salt Lake City, Utah at the time, and between the long hours and the noise and heat, I felt like I needed to completely unplug from everything. I didn't want to be around anyone. I didn't want to hear voices or music or phones or even cars. I just wanted to be alone for a while. I wasn't trying to find myself or anything dramatic like that. I just wanted silence. I've always liked being outdoors, and I've done plenty of short hikes and weekend trips. But this time, I decided to do something a little different. I planned a 4-day solo camping trip somewhere deeper, somewhere harder to reach. I picked an area I'd only ever read about online, Uinta Mountains, up in northeastern Utah. I didn't go to one of the campgrounds. I found a trailhead for a lesser-known route, Hellhole Trail, and planned to hike a few miles in until I was far enough from the road that I wouldn't hear cars or people. The plan was to carry everything I needed, set up camp near a small creek I found on a topographic map, and just stay put there for the whole time. Read a little, fish a little, sleep a lot. I even turned off my phone and left it in the glove compartment of my car at the trailhead. I left the city early that morning and made it to the trailhead by 10 a.m. It was a dirt lot, not paved, and there were only 2 other cars there. That was a good sign. I locked up the car, slung my pack on, and started walking. It was warm and sunny, and the trail started out pretty easy. I had maybe 35 pounds on my back, tent, sleeping bag, small stove, water filter, fishing pole, the usual stuff. The farther I hiked, the quieter everything got. No planes overhead, no voices, just the crunch of my boots and the occasional bird call or branch creaking in the wind. It was exactly what I wanted. I hiked about 5 miles before I stopped. There was a narrow trail that cut off the main one and dipped down toward a slow-moving stream. That was the spot I had picked on the map. When I reached it, I could see I was right. It was beautiful. There were tall lodgepole pines all around, and the stream was clear and cold. The spot had a small, flat patch of grass beside it, just enough space for my tent and a small fire pit. I set everything up slowly. I wasn't in a rush. The tent went up easy, and I gathered some wood for a fire. I sat down and ate some jerky and trail mix, then walked a little upstream and filled my filter bottle. The water tasted clean and sharp, like snowmelt. Probably was. I sat on a rock for a while, just listening. There was nothing out of place. No signs of people. No wrappers. No boot prints. No broken branches from careless hikers. Felt like nobody had been there in months, maybe years. That night, I cooked some rice and beans over my little stove and watched the stars come out. There were no clouds, no light pollution. It was the kind of sky you don't get near a city. I lay in my sleeping bag with the tent flap open, just staring at the sky until I fell asleep. The second day was even better. I woke up late, had some instant coffee and oatmeal, then wandered a little farther down the stream. I saw some trout in the water but couldn't get them to bite. Didn't really care. I was just happy to be there. Around mid-afternoon, I thought I heard something, like a distant branch breaking, but it was faint, and I figured it was just a deer or something moving through the woods. I didn't bring a gun, but I had a knife and bear spray. Not that I really thought I'd need either. I saw some small tracks in the mud, probably raccoon or coyote, but nothing that looked fresh, nothing big. I spent the rest of the day reading and sketching in a little notebook I'd brought. I'm not an artist or anything, but it helped pass the time. That night, though, things felt different. It wasn't anything obvious. I just felt more on edge. I couldn't fall asleep as easily. I kept hearing little noises outside the tent. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching. But whenever I sat up and looked around with my flashlight, there was nothing. I told myself I was being paranoid. It's natural. When you're that far out by yourself, your mind starts playing tricks on you. You hear normal forest sounds and your brain twists them into something else. Still, I slept light that night. I kept the knife within reach, and I didn't open the flap like I had the night before. When I got up the next morning, I found something strange. About 30 feet from my tent, near the edge of the stream, there were marks in the dirt, like someone had knelt down or slipped or dragged something. They weren't footprints, not really, but the moss and pine needles had been disturbed. There was a long, curved line in the dirt, maybe where a stick had been dragged. Could have been an animal, a bear or a moose, but I didn't see any clear tracks, no claw marks or hoof prints, and nothing had been taken. My food bag was still up in the tree where I hung it, untouched. I stood there for a while just staring at the marks. They didn't make sense. They were just odd. That's the only word I have for it. I tried not to let it bother me, but it sat in the back of my head the whole day. I went farther upstream to fish again, but I kept glancing back over my shoulder. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had come through my camp in the night. Something that moved carefully. Something that didn't leave clear prints. That night, I built a fire. I hadn't bothered the previous nights, but now I wanted the light. I kept it going until after midnight. I thought about packing up and hiking out, but I told myself I was just being stupid. I come all this way for quiet. The woods had given it to me. Now I was getting nervous over a few broken twigs and some dirt. Still, when I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, I zipped the tent shut tight and kept my flashlight in my hand. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up. Not from a sound exactly, but from the kind of silence that feels wrong. The kind that feels too quiet, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I lay there for a long time, not moving, just listening. Then I heard something, soft, slow, like something brushing against the side of my tent. I didn't move. I held my breath and just listened. Another sound, a footstep, not an animal step, not the quick, light movement of a deer or a raccoon. This was heavier, careful, deliberate. I flicked my flashlight on and aimed it at the wall of the tent, but I couldn't see anything through the fabric. I didn't hear anything run. No crash of branches, no panic. Whatever it was had moved away slowly. Silently, I stayed awake until dawn, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other. When the sun finally came up, I got out of the tent and checked the area again. More marks in the dirt, near the fire pit this time. Same as before. Long scuffs, patches where the moss was scraped away. No prints, no clear sign of what made them. I packed up. I wasn't going to spend another night out there. I took my time hiking out, but I was tense the whole way. I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me. I kept stopping to look over my shoulder. The forest felt wrong now, too still. I didn't see a single person the whole 5 miles back to the trailhead. When I finally saw my car, I felt my chest loosen up for the first time in hours. But when I got to the car, something was off again. There was a small smear of dirt on the passenger side window. Not a handprint, just a weird smudge, like something had leaned against it. It hadn't rained. There wasn't mud around. It was out of place. I opened the door and checked inside. Nothing was missing. The phone was still in the glove box, but the feeling was back, like someone had been near my stuff, watching. I got in and started driving without even changing out of my boots. It took me a few hours to get back to the city. I showered, ate, slept, but I couldn't stop thinking about the trip. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I knew it wasn't in my head. I know what a raccoon sounds like. I know what a deer looks like. This wasn't either of those. Whatever was out there had come close, had circled me, had watched. A week later, I went online and searched the area. Hellhole Trail, Uinta Mountains. I didn't find much, just a few trip reports. One guy mentioned seeing a man in the woods late at night who didn't say anything, just stood still and watched him from the trees. Another post was from a woman who said her tent had been slashed while she was hiking nearby, but she thought it might have been kids. None of it was proof, just scattered stories. But it made me wonder. I haven't been camping alone since. I still go on day hikes. I still love the woods, but I don't sleep out there by myself anymore. Not because of bears, not because of ghosts, but because someone else might be out there. Someone who doesn't want to be found. Someone who moves carefully, quietly, and watches. It was the last week of September when I took time off from work and decided to go on a solo camping trip in the northern woods of Michigan. I had been stressed out for months, just working long days at the warehouse, dealing with people, traffic, noise, everything piling up on me. I didn't want to go somewhere touristy or flashy. I wanted to go somewhere quiet and isolated, where I could hear myself breathe, maybe fish a little, sit by the fire, and just reset my brain. I picked a spot I found online, a remote lake near the Upper Peninsula, barely marked on any map, surrounded by thick forest and only accessible by an old logging trail. The few reviews I found talked about how peaceful it was and how you were unlikely to see anyone else for days. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed my gear the night before: tent, sleeping bag, food for 4 days, fishing rod, a cooler, fire starter, a few knives, a small hatchet, 2 flashlights, extra batteries, and my old .22 rifle. I never really expected to use it, but I always brought it just in case I ran into a bear or something. The weather was supposed to be clear, maybe a little chilly at night, but nothing too harsh. I left early that morning, got coffee at a gas station on the way, and drove 5 hours north. The further I got, the fewer cars I saw. Eventually, I turned onto a dirt road, and after about 30 minutes of slow, bumpy driving, I reached the trailhead. The parking area was just a flat patch of dirt with enough space for maybe 2 cars. There weren't any other vehicles there. I parked, double-checked my pack, locked the truck, and started hiking. The trail was overgrown in places and barely visible in others. It wound through thick woods for about 3 miles until I reached the lake. It was just as beautiful as I'd imagined. The water was still and black, surrounded by tall pines and birch trees. No signs of people, no sound but the breeze and birds. I set up my tent near the edge of the lake, where the ground was flat and covered in pine needles. I had a good view of the water and enough distance from the trees to be safe from falling branches. After setting everything up, I gathered wood and built a fire pit with stones. I cooked some sausages over the flames and ate as the sun dipped behind the trees, turning the lake orange. That night, I slept harder than I had in months. Just the sound of leaves and crickets outside, the cold air pressing against the sides of the tent, and nothing else. The next 2 days were the same kind of peaceful. I spent my time walking around the lake, fishing, reading, and just sitting still. I didn't bring my phone except for emergencies, and I left it off most of the time. I saw deer once, drinking at the far side of the lake, and watched a bald eagle skim across the water. It was the kind of silence that makes you realize how noisy your life usually is. On the 3rd night, something felt a little off. I had gone to sleep like usual, after eating and tending the fire until it burned down to coals. I remember waking up in the middle of the night, not suddenly, just kind of slowly becoming aware that I was awake. There wasn't any sound, not even the usual rustling or insects. I thought maybe I'd just been dreaming, but I had that odd feeling you get when your instincts are trying to tell you something. I stayed still for a long time, listening. I didn't hear anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I finally unzipped the tent quietly and stuck my head out. The moon was bright enough to see the outline of the trees, and the lake was smooth like glass. I waited, staring at the woods, trying to pick out any movement, but everything looked still. I figured it was just my imagination and went back inside, but I left my boots near the zipper in case I needed to get out quickly. It took me a while to fall back asleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and immediately noticed something strange. There were small marks in the dirt near the fire pit. At first, I thought they might be animal tracks, maybe raccoons or something, but they didn't look quite right. They were shallow, narrow, and came in from the woods. They stopped about 10 feet from the tent and then went back the way they came. I crouched down and studied them for a while, trying to figure out what made them. The shape wasn't right for deer or coyotes, and they were too far apart for smaller animals. They looked almost like the indentations of shoes, but not deep enough to be from someone walking normally. I brushed it off. Maybe it was an animal I wasn't familiar with. Maybe the ground was just soft in places and made weird shapes. I kept telling myself not to let my imagination get carried away. Still, I couldn't get that feeling out of my head, that sense of being watched. That day, I went for a longer hike, trying to shake off the unease. I circled the lake, taking my time, looking for signs of other people or anything unusual. The woods were quiet again, too quiet. I didn't even see any birds, which felt strange. Normally, you'd hear at least the occasional woodpecker or squirrel. It was like everything had packed up and left. I got back to camp around 5 p.m. and rebuilt the fire. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling jumpy. I tried to read, but I couldn't focus. I cooked some food and ate fast, and by the time the sun went down, I was already on edge. I made sure everything was locked up in the bear canister and pulled into the tent early. I lay there in my sleeping bag, flashlight in my hand, rifle next to me, just staring at the ceiling of the tent. Around midnight, I heard it. A single footstep outside. Just one. The kind of sound someone makes when they step on a branch and break it under their weight. Not a crash, not a bunch of movement, just one deliberate, quiet snap. I didn't move. My heart started racing, and my ears strained to pick up any follow-up noise. But there was nothing. 5 minutes passed. 10. Then I heard a faint shuffle, like something brushing against the edge of the tent, down near my feet. I didn't even breathe. My flashlight was still in my hand, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to give away my position. My other hand was slowly moving toward the rifle. I wrapped my fingers around it and waited. Every muscle in my body was locked. Another few minutes passed. Then silence again. I stayed like that for at least an hour, barely blinking. I don't think I slept at all. Eventually, the sky started to lighten outside, and I felt safe enough to move. I unzipped the tent slowly and crawled out. What I saw made my stomach drop. There were boot prints all around my tent. Human boot prints. They circled the whole thing. Some passed close by the fire pit, others led toward the woods. There were at least a dozen different impressions in the pine needles and dirt, and they weren't mine. I checked. My boots were still inside the tent, dry and clean. I hadn't walked around that night. I stood there for a long time, staring at the prints. Then I walked toward the trees, trying to follow them. They led about 20 feet into the woods and then just vanished. The pine needles made it hard to track, and I couldn't tell where the person had come from or gone. But someone had definitely been there, watching me. I packed up my gear as fast as I could. I didn't eat. I didn't even bother folding the tent properly. Just jammed everything into my pack. I kept the rifle in my hands the whole time. When I was ready, I started hiking back down the trail, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. The woods were still too quiet. No wind, no birds, nothing. About halfway back to my truck, I noticed something else. A broken tree branch hanging low over the trail, about chest height. That hadn't been there before. It looked like it had been snapped intentionally and bent across the path. I stepped over it and kept moving. Another 100 yards down, I saw a pile of small rocks stacked in the middle of the trail. That hadn't been there either. Someone was following me, or maybe they'd been ahead of me. I picked up the pace, trying not to run but moving fast. I gripped the rifle tighter, constantly scanning the trees. The last half mile felt like it took an hour. When I finally saw my truck through the trees, I almost broke into a sprint. The truck was untouched. I got in, locked the doors immediately, and started the engine. I didn't look back. I just drove. The tires skidded a little on the dirt as I pulled out, and I didn't slow down until I was back on the main road. It took me a few hours to fully calm down. I stopped at a diner about 50 miles south and sat there with a cup of coffee, trying to make sense of everything. The prints, the noise, the rearranged trail. None of it made sense unless someone had been out there, watching me, messing with me. But why? There was nothing valuable in my camp. No one had taken anything. They could have hurt me, but they didn't. They just watched. When I got home, I didn't unpack right away. I left everything in the garage and sat in the living room with the curtains closed. For days, I kept thinking about those boot prints and the sound of that single footstep outside my tent. I checked local news for anything about missing people or strange reports near that lake. But there was nothing. I didn't report it to the police. What would I even say? I haven't gone camping alone since. I still think about it sometimes. About how far away that place was, how quiet it was, how whoever was out there knew I was alone. I think that's what gets me the most. They knew I was by myself. They knew exactly where I was. It was early September, just after Labor Day, when most people had already packed up their summer gear and gone back to work or school. That's part of why I picked that time to head out. Fewer people meant more peace and quiet, more space and more time to think. I had been stressed at work for a while and needed to disconnect, so I planned a solo camping trip for 4 days. Nothing fancy, just me, a tent, some gear, a backpack, and the woods. I picked a spot I'd never been to before, Tamarack Lake, up in northern Minnesota. A friend of mine had been there a couple years ago and said it was quiet, remote, and surrounded by good trails. When I looked it up, the area checked out. It wasn't part of a big campground or anything. No power, no cell signal, no ranger stations. Just an unmarked dirt road that led into the forest and a couple of old trails that locals used for hiking and hunting. It was exactly the kind of quiet I was looking for. I drove up in my old Subaru and reached the edge of the dirt road around 3 in the afternoon. The last town I passed through was almost 30 miles behind me, and I hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour. The dirt road itself was rough, narrow, and full of small potholes, but the car made it through. After about 20 minutes down that road, I found a small clearing that looked like it had been used before. The grass was flattened in a few places, and there was an old fire ring made of rocks. It was right near a small ridge that overlooked a narrow bend in a creek. I could hear the water moving below, slow and steady. Trees were tall and dense on all sides, mostly pines and birches. The sun filtered through the branches, making everything look gold and green. I parked and got to work setting up camp. I pitched my tent in the middle of the clearing and unpacked my gear. Sleeping bag, food cooler, water jug, portable stove, and a bear canister to keep food safe. I didn't bring anything too fancy, just freeze-dried meals and snacks, enough water to last if I rationed carefully, and a small water filter in case I needed more from the creek. By the time everything was set up, it was almost 5:30. I gathered some dry wood from the edge of the trees and started a small fire in the ring. The air was already cooling down, and the fire felt good. I made dinner, just a hot pouch of beef stew, and sat by the flames as the light faded. It was quiet except for the creek and the rustling of trees. No engines, no voices, no buzzing phones, just the forest. I stayed up until it was fully dark, watching the fire and occasionally throwing in another log. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, the air was cold and crisp. I zipped the tent shut, pulled the bag up to my neck, and listened to the sounds of the woods. A few owls, some distant rustling, maybe a deer moving through the trees. It all felt normal, peaceful. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a noise. It wasn't loud, just a soft crunching sound, like leaves and twigs being stepped on. I stayed still and listened. It was hard to tell how far away it was. Could have been anything, raccoons, maybe a fox. The forest was full of animals, and I was the visitor. Still, I kept my hand close to the flashlight next to me and listened for a while. The noise stopped after a minute or so. I eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, the sun came through the tent fabric, warming it up. I got up, stretched, and stepped outside. Everything looked fine. No signs of anything unusual. I made oatmeal and coffee on the small stove and then hiked down to the creek to wash up a little. I brought the filter and topped off my water bottles. After that, I decided to explore a bit. There was a narrow trail leading north from the campsite, running parallel to the creek. It wasn't marked, just slightly worn down from use, maybe by hunters or other campers. I followed it for about an hour. It curved around a ridge and then dipped down into a small valley full of ferns and mossy boulders. I stopped for a snack and turned around after a while. I wasn't trying to get lost. When I got back to camp, something was off. Took me a moment to figure it out. My backpack, which I had left zipped and placed next to the tent, had been moved. It wasn't where I left it. It was sitting about 5 feet away, like someone had picked it up and set it down again. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I checked inside. Everything was still there. Nothing missing, nothing stolen, not even disturbed. My food was still sealed in the bear canister, but it bothered me. I told myself maybe I had just left it in that spot without realizing. Maybe I bumped it when I left in the morning and didn't notice, but it didn't sit right. I kept thinking about the noise I heard during the night. I walked a slow circle around the camp, checking for tracks or anything unusual. The ground was dry, so if someone or something had walked through, they didn't leave much. I didn't find anything useful. That night, I built a slightly bigger fire. I didn't feel as calm as I did the night before. I kept turning towards small sounds, little cracks and snaps from the trees. I finished dinner quickly and stayed alert. I didn't drink much water, trying not to need to leave the tent during the night. When I did finally go to sleep, I kept the flashlight in one hand and a small camping knife in the other. Not that it would help much against anything serious, but it made me feel better. Again, I woke up in the middle of the night. This time it was louder, definite movement outside the tent. Slow, steady steps, not animal-like, heavier. I held my breath and listened. Whatever it was moved from one side of the tent to the other, then stopped. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. After what felt like forever, the steps faded into the trees. I waited until the sun was fully up before I got out. I looked around the clearing. Same as before, no tracks, no broken branches, nothing obvious. But the bear canister had been moved. It was 10 feet from where I left it, lying on its side, still sealed, still locked. Something had tried to get into it, or maybe just wanted to see what it was. That was the moment I knew I wasn't alone out there. I started thinking, maybe a hunter camping nearby, or someone passing through. But why wouldn't they say anything? Why come near my tent in the middle of the night? I hadn't seen or heard a vehicle in 2 days. No voices, no other fires, nothing. I thought about packing up, but I didn't want to panic and ruin the trip. Could still be nothing. I told myself I'd do one more night, and if anything else happened, I'd leave in the morning. I spent most of the day gathering wood, making sure I had enough to keep the fire going bright all night. I also tied a string around the bear canister and connected it to a tin cup with a small rock inside, like a makeshift noise alarm. I figured if anything touched the canister again, I'd hear it rattle. I stayed up late that night. The fire was big and bright, and I sat close to it, watching the woods. Around 11:30, I heard a single snap, a branch maybe 50 feet away. Not a loud crash, just one clean break. I grabbed the flashlight and scanned the woods, but didn't see anything. The firelight didn't reach that far. I stayed outside until almost 2 a.m., then crawled into the tent, fully clothed with boots on, light in hand. Sometime after 3, the cup rattled. Just once. Not loud, but clear. I froze. Then I heard steps. Slow ones. They stopped right next to the tent. I could hear breathing. Not heavy, but close. I sat up, heart pounding, and turned the flashlight on, aiming it toward the noise through the tent wall. I couldn't see much through the fabric, just a vague shadow. The breathing stopped. A few seconds later, I heard retreating steps. Then silence. At sunrise, I packed everything. Fast. Threw gear into the car without folding anything. Just jammed it in and got out. I didn't eat, didn't make coffee, didn't even check the creek. I just drove, bouncing down the dirt road until I hit the pavement. I drove all the way to the nearest gas station, 2 towns over. When I got there, I finally felt my shoulders relax a little. I used the bathroom, washed up, and bought a hot sandwich and a bottle of water. I sat in the car, windows down, engine off, just eating and listening to cars on the road. The normal sounds felt good. I looked around the car, making sure everything was there. That's when I noticed something that chilled me worse than the footsteps had. In the back seat, on top of my sleeping bag, was a single leaf. Brown and dry. Nothing strange about that, except I had zipped every window and door in the car before I left. I had packed everything myself. That leaf wasn't from the camp. It wasn't one I remembered seeing. It was just sitting there, dead center, like someone had opened the door, put it down, and closed it again. That's when I realized someone had been watching me the whole time. Not just passing through. Watching, following, waiting. Maybe they never meant to hurt me, or maybe they were building up to it. I didn't care to find out. I drove straight home and didn't stop except for gas. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still think about it, especially at night. The sound of breathing outside my tent. The quiet steps. The moved objects. It was never loud, never aggressive, but it was real. I know it was. It was early September, just after Labor Day, when I decided to take a solo camping trip. I'd been working non-stop since spring and felt burnt out. The idea of being alone in the woods, no phones, no people, no noise, seemed like the perfect way to clear my head. I picked a remote area in northern Maine that I'd read about online. It wasn't part of a major park or campground, just a stretch of forest land near the Canadian border, filled with unmarked logging roads, small lakes, and forgotten trails. I packed everything carefully. A 2-person tent, a heavy-duty sleeping bag, water filtration gear, a first aid kit, bear spray, my hatchet, a compact stove, a small pot, and enough dehydrated meals for 5 days. I brought my GPS and a compass, though I was planning to follow an old trail I'd read about on a forum. A guy had shared his route through that area and said it was peaceful and untouched. That was exactly what I wanted. I also brought a printed map of the area just in case. I left my car on the shoulder of a dirt road about 20 miles past the last gas station. There were no signs, no markers, just a gap in the tree line where a path led down into the woods. I walked for about 6 hours that first day, following a barely there trail. It was rough terrain, muddy patches, fallen trees, and steep inclines. But it was beautiful, the kind of silence you can only get deep in the forest. Just the wind moving through the trees and the occasional cry of a bird overhead. I made camp near a small creek around dusk. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun dipped below the treetops. I set up my tent, boiled some water for dinner, and sat by a little fire I made with dry sticks and pine cones. I remember staring at the orange light of the flames, feeling calm for the first time in months. There was no signal, no service, no distractions. Just the woods and me. That first night was uneventful. I heard a few animals moving around outside my tent, but nothing alarming. Just normal forest noise. I woke up early and continued on the trail the next morning. I wanted to make it to a lake I'd seen on the map, a place called Twin Pines Lake. It was about a day and a half's hike from where I'd started. The trail got narrower and more overgrown as I went, and by the second afternoon, it was hard to tell if I was even following a trail anymore. I had to stop and check the map every few minutes. My GPS was spotty and slow, probably because of the tree cover. I pushed through some dense brush and came out onto a flat, rocky area just as the sun was starting to drop. I found the lake. It was small and still almost glass-like. Pines surrounded it on all sides, and there wasn't a single sign of people. No litter, no fire pits, nothing. I was probably the only person who'd been there in months, maybe longer. I picked a spot close to the water and set up camp. I even washed my face and hands in the lake. The water was freezing, but it felt good. That night, things felt different. I can't really explain it. There was a strange tension in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. I didn't hear the usual crickets or frogs. No owls, just silence. I tried to brush it off as paranoia. Maybe I was just unused to being that isolated. Still, I kept my hatchet close and made sure my bear spray was within reach inside the tent. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. There was no sound, no movement, just that tight silence again. I laid there listening, heart beating fast for no reason I could name. Then I heard something. Not an animal. It was a snapping sound. Not a twig, but like something heavy had stepped on a branch. It wasn't close, maybe 50 yards off, but it was steady. Another step, then another. Slow, deliberate, not the way a deer moves or a bear. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The steps continued for maybe a minute, then stopped. I waited. Nothing. Just silence again. I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I found footprints near the edge of the lake. They weren't mine. I hadn't been down that far. The prints were from boots. Not huge, but definitely adult-sized. They led from the woods to the water, then disappeared. I looked around for more signs, but there was nothing. No gear, no fire pit, no canoe, nothing. Just the footprints and silence. I tried to tell myself maybe it was another hiker. Maybe someone else was camping nearby. But I'd seen no signs of anyone else for 2 full days. No wrappers, no trampled grass, nothing. And what kind of hiker walks to a lake in the middle of the night, leaves no trace, and walks off again without making a sound? I packed up and decided to keep moving. I didn't want to stay in that spot another night. I followed the shoreline east, hoping to find a better trail or maybe a spot with higher ground. Around noon, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Another footprint, just one, in a muddy patch between 2 rocks. It wasn't mine, and it was fresh. The print was deep, meaning the person had some weight. The mud was still damp around the edges. Couldn't have been more than an hour old. That meant someone was nearby, watching, maybe. I scanned the trees, trying to see movement, but everything was still. I picked up my pace and kept moving, trying to stick to areas where I'd leave less of a trail. I started taking weirder paths, crossing streams, walking over rocks, to throw off anyone who might be following me. Every now and then, I'd stop and listen. Sometimes I thought I heard movement behind me, but it would always stop when I did. I hiked until I couldn't anymore and set up camp on a ridge with a good view of the woods below. I didn't start a fire. I didn't cook. Just ate a cold meal bar and lay down with my hatchet in one hand. I was too tired to think straight, but too wired to sleep properly. Every sound outside made my body go tense. That night, I swear I heard breathing near the tent. Not loud, but close. Steady, like someone standing right outside. I couldn't bring myself to unzip the flap. I just laid there, heart racing, gripping my hatchet until my hand ached. Eventually, the sound faded. Or maybe I passed out. I don't know. At first light, I was up and moving. I didn't even pack my tent. Just left it. I needed to get out. I followed my compass west, hoping to loop back toward the dirt road where I'd left my car. I was off trail by that point, moving through thick woods. Branches tore at my jacket and face. I barely stopped to drink. Every few minutes, I looked over my shoulder. I couldn't shake the feeling I was being followed. Midday, I found a broken tree with a piece of fabric stuck to it. Green like army green, not from any of my gear. I didn't touch it, just kept going. That afternoon, I saw smoke in the distance. Thin, gray smoke rising above the trees. It wasn't from me.
Primer ang litany fires.
I slowed down, crouched low, and moved carefully toward the source. The smoke was coming from a small campfire in a clearing, but there was no tent, no sleeping bag, just a fire still burning low. And beside it, a pile of fresh-cut branches and a large, black plastic bag. I watched for 10 minutes but saw no one. I couldn't get closer without making noise. My hands were shaking. I backed away slowly and headed in the opposite direction. That night, I didn't stop. I kept walking with my flashlight, moving through the dark forest, tripping on roots, scraping against trees. I just wanted out. I kept checking my compass, and by early morning I found a stream that looked familiar. I followed it for hours until it led to a larger trail, one I recognized from the hike in. My legs were shot. I hadn't slept, barely eaten, but I pushed myself. Late that afternoon, I saw the dirt road through the trees. My car was still there, untouched. I drove without stopping until I reached the next town. I didn't report anything. I didn't know what to say. There were no crimes I could prove, no names, no real evidence. Just footprints, a feeling, and a fire that didn't belong. That was 8 months ago. I haven't been camping since. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. Maybe they were just a survivalist living off the grid. Maybe they were tracking animals, or maybe they were tracking me. All I know is I've never felt that kind of fear before. The kind that makes your body feel cold, even when you're sweating. I think about that night often. The breathing outside the tent, the footsteps by the lake, the silent fire in the clearing. I think about how close I probably came to something I don't want to understand. I still go for hikes sometimes, but never alone, never off trail, and never that far out. Because once you know that there are people out there who move through the woods without being seen, people who leave no sign except a footprint in the mud, it changes how you see the trees. You stop thinking of the forest as quiet and peaceful. You start seeing it as a place where someone could be watching you from 10 feet away, and you'd never know. I decided to take a few days off work in the summer of 2019. I was 31 at the time, working as a building inspector in a small city in Southern Oregon. I had no wife, no kids, and I'd been getting burned out. Between long drives and crawling around under floors and attics, I just needed a break. I didn't want to go too far or spend too much, so I thought I'd do a simple solo camping trip. Nothing fancy, just a weekend out in nature with no one around. I picked a place that I had driven by years ago but never explored. It was called Oak Ridge Basin, a part of the Cascade foothills that didn't get a lot of traffic. There were a few back roads leading in, some old fire service trails, and an abandoned Forest Service cabin miles away from the main roads. I wasn't interested in the cabin, just the area around it. It was deep enough in the woods that I figured I'd get some peace and quiet, maybe do a little hiking, and reset my head. I loaded up my old Ford Explorer with gear, a good tent, sleeping bag, food, water jugs, a little propane stove, and some books. I even brought a small solar charger for my phone. although I planned to keep it off most of the time. I liked the idea of being unreachable.
No emails, no texts.
Just trees, dirt, and quiet. I left early Friday morning. It was a warm day, not too hot, and the drive took about 2.5 hours. The last 30 minutes were rough dirt roads, winding through tall pines and uneven terrain. I had a paper map I'd printed since there was no signal out there. I found a flat, quiet spot about a mile from the old fire road, with a little clearing surrounded by pine and fir trees. There was no one around. No other cars, no trash, no signs anyone had camped there in a long time. I parked and unpacked. The ground was dry and soft with needles and leaves. I set up my tent facing a little slope that led down to a dry creek bed. I had a small campfire ring made of rocks and a couple of logs that made good seats. I didn't plan on using the fire much, just enough to keep warm in the evening. That first day was fine. I walked around the area, hiked about a mile into the woods, and found some deer tracks, a few old trail markers, and lots of silence. It was nice. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were wind in the trees and the occasional bird. I cooked some beans and rice on my little stove, read for an hour, and crawled into my tent before it got too cold. I left the rain fly off so I could see the stars. They were bright and endless out there. I slept well. The second day started off normal too. I made some coffee with my camp kettle and walked further down the creek bed, hoping to find where it might meet a river or stream. Didn't. It just curved and wound through the forest before vanishing into a patch of thicker underbrush. I followed some game trails for a while, careful not to get turned around. I marked my path with little sticks and broken twigs pointing the way back. I'm not a survivalist or anything, but I know basic trail etiquette. That afternoon, after lunch, I hiked up a ridge to the west of camp. The view was great. You could see across miles of tree-covered hills, with no buildings or roads in sight. As I started back down, I noticed something odd. There was a flat area, maybe 30 yards wide, where the trees were thinner, but not from fire or clear cutting. It just felt wrong. Some of the trees had broken tops, not like from lightning or wind, more like they'd been snapped off. The ground had shallow divots and old tire marks, like someone had driven heavy equipment through there a long time ago. It didn't look fresh, maybe years old, but it stood out. I kept walking, made it back to camp just before dusk, and sat down to rest. I didn't think much of the odd clearing at the time. I figured it might have been a logging test site or something. I made dinner, read again, and turned in early. That night was different. Around 1 or 2 a.m., I woke up. Not from a sound, but just something felt off. You know that feeling when your body knows something before your mind does? I lay still and listened. There was no wind.
No owls, no insects.
Just silence. Total silence. That's what set me on edge. I sat up slowly and looked through the mesh of my tent. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I thought maybe it was just a deer or some animal passing by. I stayed awake for maybe an hour, dozing off and waking up again every few minutes. Nothing happened. Eventually, I fell asleep. In the morning, everything looked normal, but I noticed some faint impressions in the dirt about 10 feet from my tent. They weren't footprints exactly. They looked more like shallow spots in the dirt, a little longer than my shoe with rough outlines, like someone had stepped there but not fully. They weren't mine. I hadn't walked that way. They were spaced too far apart to be animal prints. Maybe someone had come through in the night, just checking things out, then left. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Could have been an animal I didn't recognize. I kept busy. I hiked east this time, through some denser patches of forest, and found what looked like an old trail completely overgrown. It had little markers nailed to trees, probably from decades ago. Some were so faded you could barely read them. One said mile 3, and that was the only one with legible writing. I followed it for a bit until it ended at a fallen tree and thick brush. When I turned back toward camp, I felt that unease again. It wasn't like fear, more like I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone walking behind me, but there was nothing, just trees. Back at camp, I noticed one of the water jugs I had sitting by the fire ring was knocked over. It was a 5-gallon jug, and it had a dent in the side like someone had dropped it. I know I didn't leave it like that. It was sitting flat the night before. Nothing else was touched. My food was sealed. My gear was still packed neatly. But that jug, that didn't sit right. That night, I stayed up later. I didn't want to sleep. I kept my flashlight close and sat by the fire until it burned down to embers. The woods were quiet again. Too quiet. I finally climbed into the tent around midnight, zipped everything up tight, and lay there staring at the mesh ceiling. I kept the flashlight in my hand, just resting on my chest. At some point, I must have dozed off. I don't know what time it was, but I woke to a sound this time. It was soft, a crunch, like a footstep, then another. I froze. I didn't breathe. My eyes adjusted, and I saw a shape just outside the tent. Not fully clear, just a shadow blocking the starlight. It stood still, no movement. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to call out or shine the light. I just lay there. The shape moved slowly around the tent. I could hear it brushing against the fabric. Then it stopped again, near the front zipper. I held my breath so long my chest started to hurt. After a while, the shape moved off toward the trees. I heard one more crunch, then nothing. I waited a long time before moving, maybe 30 minutes. I unzipped the tent quietly and looked around. I didn't see anything. The air was cold, and the ground looked untouched.
No prints, no markings.
But I knew something had been there. I didn't sleep again. The next morning, I packed up. Fast. I didn't even make coffee or eat. I just threw everything into the back of the Explorer and got out of there. I didn't care about the rest of the trip. Something was wrong with that place. I followed my map back to the main road and didn't stop until I hit paved highway. A week later, I still couldn't shake it. So I did some research. I looked up Oak Ridge Basin, the area I camped in. It turns out there used to be some kind of research station out there in the 80s. Government-funded, small-scale logging and soil studies. But it was shut down after a couple of accidents. Equipment failures, staff going missing. Nothing major reported publicly, just a few vague mentions in forestry newsletters and online forums. No one talked about it anymore. I even found a scanned PDF from 1987 that mentioned unauthorized personnel entering restricted zones, and something about surveillance measures being reconsidered. That was it. No more details. I couldn't find anything else. I don't know who or what was out there those nights. It wasn't an animal. It didn't behave like one. And it didn't take anything. It just watched, moved around. It didn't make noise, didn't try to harm me. But it knew I was there. And I think it wanted me gone. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still hike, still spend time outdoors, but I stay in populated areas now. Trails with signs and rangers and other people. I don't need peace and quiet like that anymore. Not if it comes with that kind of silence. I had always liked being outside. Ever since I was a teenager, I'd go hiking or camping any chance I got. It wasn't about escaping anything. I liked the quiet, the sense of being far from people, away from noise. There was something peaceful about sleeping in a tent with only the sounds of birds or wind in the trees. I didn't do it to test myself or anything. It was just a habit, like some people watch shows or read books. I liked walking in forests and sleeping under the stars. In August of 2019, I took some time off work. I was living in Pittsburgh then, working a lot of hours as a mechanic. My back was always sore, hands cracked from grease. I had saved up enough vacation time to get away for a full week. I wanted to go somewhere new, not just the usual places I'd been to in Pennsylvania. I picked a spot after looking through some online forums, George Washington and Jefferson National Forests in Western Virginia. Not one of the busiest national parks, but big and with a lot of remote areas. That sounded good to me. I liked places where there weren't too many people. I packed my gear carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, camping stove, food for a week, water filter, bear spray, GPS, paper map, extra socks, everything you're supposed to bring. I had my little Ford Ranger, threw it all in the back and drove south. It was around a 5-hour drive. I stopped once to get gas and again to grab a sandwich. It was hot in the 80s and the sky was clear. When I got there, I parked in one of the lots near a trailhead that led up into the woods. I left a note in my truck saying when I'd be back, something I always did just in case. I had planned to hike in about 10 miles, then find a spot to set up camp near a stream I saw on the map. No cell signal, of course, but I brought a satellite communicator just in case of emergencies. The trail was quiet. I didn't see another person the entire hike. The path was narrow but well marked with blazes on the trees. It wound uphill, then leveled out for a while. I saw deer, a black snake, some squirrels. The forest smelled like pine and dirt and old leaves. After about 5 hours of walking, I found the stream I was looking for. It was shallow, cold, and perfect for filtering water. I picked a spot about 200 feet off the trail, far enough that I wouldn't be noticed but close enough that I wouldn't get lost finding it again. I cleared some ground, pitched my tent, and set up my little stove. That first night, I ate a freeze-dried meal and watched the sun go down through the trees. I was tired, but it was a good tired. The kind you get from moving your body, not from stress. The next 2 days were more of the same. I'd wake up early, make coffee, and then go for long walks with my day pack. I followed the stream for a while, climbed a small ridge, took photos, sat around. I didn't see any other hikers, just tracks maybe 2 or 3 days old. I didn't think much of it. I liked that kind of solitude. At night, I'd sit by the small fire I made, read for a while, then crawl into my sleeping bag and fall asleep. But on the 4th day, something changed. It was little at first. I noticed some branches snapped near the edge of my camp. Not clean breaks, more like they were stepped on. I figured it was a deer or maybe a bear, though I hadn't seen any fresh scat or markings around. I made more noise than usual that day, talking out loud, clapping every once in a while, just to let anything know I was around. I carried the bear spray on my belt, too. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing things, not loud, but soft, like the crunch of leaves. I told myself it was probably nothing. Animals move around at night. But still, I laid there with my ears open, hand on the flashlight. At one point, I thought I heard breathing, but when I sat up and unzipped the tent, I didn't see anything, just trees and darkness. Still, I moved my food even farther from the tent and made sure everything was sealed. The next morning, I checked around camp. I found what looked like a partial footprint in some soft dirt near the stream. Not a bear, a shoe, a boot print, not mine. The tread was different, deeper, wider. It looked fresh, maybe from the night before or earlier that morning. I stood there for a while, just looking at it. I wasn't sure what to think. It's not illegal for someone else to be out there. It's public land. But it was the first time I felt uneasy. I hadn't seen or heard anyone in days, and now this. I walked up and down the stream for a bit, trying to see if there were more prints, but the ground was too dry in most places. I thought about packing up and hiking out early, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe someone had passed through and didn't see my camp. Maybe it was from before I even got there. Still, I changed how I did things. I stopped making fires. I kept my gear packed tighter. I started hanging my food higher and farther from the tent. I even put a few stones in a small tin can and tied it near the trail, about 100 feet from camp. It would make noise if someone came close. I figured if it stayed quiet overnight, I'd relax a little. That night, I stayed awake longer than usual. The forest was almost too quiet. No bugs, no wind, just stillness. Around 1 a.m., I heard the tin can rattle, just once. A short clink. I froze. Then nothing. I lay there, not even breathing. After 5 minutes, I slowly unzipped the tent just an inch and peered out. I couldn't see anything. I held the flashlight but didn't turn it on. I didn't want to give away my position. Eventually, I sat up, turned on the light, and scanned the woods. Nothing moved. But when I checked the tin can in the morning, it had been moved. Not knocked over, just shifted slightly. The string looked tighter, like someone had touched it. I looked for tracks, but didn't find any fresh ones. Now I was on edge. I wasn't scared exactly, but alert. That kind of feeling when you know something is off, but you can't prove it. I told myself again it could have been a raccoon or something, but I'd camped too many times to believe that fully. The next day, I decided I'd leave early. I only had 2 nights left on my trip, but I didn't feel right staying anymore. I packed my gear fast, skipped breakfast, and started hiking back toward the trailhead. The whole time I kept checking behind me. The trees felt too close. I didn't hear anything, but the feeling stayed with me, like someone was watching. After about 2 hours of hiking, I stopped for water near a big rock outcropping. As I crouched to filter some water, I noticed something. On the flat part of the rock, someone had drawn a symbol with charcoal or something black. Just a rough circle with a line through it. It didn't mean anything to me, but it hadn't been there a few days ago when I passed through. Now I was nervous. I felt my heartbeat pick up. I kept going faster now. I thought about using the satellite communicator to call for help, but what would I say? That I saw a footprint and a weird mark on a rock? That wasn't enough. I walked almost non-stop for the rest of the day, maybe 14 miles. My legs hurt, but I didn't care. I wanted to be close to the parking area before dark. Around 6 p.m., I found a small clearing off the trail, just 3 miles from the lot. I set up the tent, but I didn't unpack anything else. No stove, no food. I just sat with my back against a tree and waited for dark. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat inside the tent with my flashlight and bear spray, just listening. Around midnight, I heard something again. Not an animal. Steps. Soft, careful steps. I turned off the flashlight and held my breath. The steps came closer, stopped maybe 30 feet away. Then nothing. I stayed like that for hours. My body was stiff, but I didn't move. I don't think I even blinked. When the sky started getting light, I waited another 30 minutes before crawling out. No one was there. No footprints. Nothing. I packed everything in under 10 minutes and started walking. I made it to the truck by 8 a.m. I got in, locked the doors, and just sat there for a while. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not at first. What would I even say? I didn't have any proof. Just feelings, some broken branches, a footprint, a sound in the night. A week later, back at home, I was going through the photos on my phone. I didn't take many, just trees, the stream, some rock formations. But then I saw one that made my stomach drop. It was a photo of my camp from the second day. My tent, the trees around it. But in the very back, almost out of focus, there was a shape. A person partly hidden behind a tree. Not moving, just standing there. I hadn't noticed it when I took the photo. I zoomed in as far as I could. No details, just the outline. But it was someone. Someone standing there watching my camp in the middle of the day. I deleted the photo. After that, I stopped camping alone. I still hike sometimes, but I stay close to town. I don't sleep in the woods anymore. I don't trust the quiet like I used to, because I know now, in a way I didn't before, that not everyone out there wants to be left alone. Some people go into the woods for other reasons. Reasons I don't want to understand. And I was lucky, because I was 32 when I decided to take some time off work and head out on a solo camping trip. I'd been working long hours for months, barely seeing daylight, and I was starting to feel the weight of stress in my bones. My job in a warehouse in Southern Oregon had me on my feet all day, moving boxes and managing the loading schedules. Paid the bills, but it was draining. I wanted a break. Something quiet, far away from people, phones, and noise. I figured I'd find a remote campsite, fish a little, read, sleep under the stars, and come back feeling like a human again. I picked a place called Eagle Lake in Northern California. It wasn't popular like Lake Tahoe or Shasta, which was exactly why I chose it. I'd found it mentioned on an old hiking forum. The post was years old, and the photos looked nice. Clear water, pine trees, and empty trails. I called the ranger station beforehand, and the guy told me the area was open, not too crowded, and weather was mild. That was enough for me. I packed up my tent, sleeping bag, cooler, food, fishing gear, and the rest of the essentials. I had an old silver Toyota Tacoma that still ran decent, and I loaded everything into the back. I left on a Thursday morning in late September, hoping to catch the tail end of summer before the cold started to roll in. The drive took me most of the day. Once I passed Reading and got onto the smaller highways, traffic thinned out and the trees got taller. My GPS lost signal about 30 miles from the lake, but I had printed out directions, just in case. The road leading to the lake turned to gravel for the last 6 or 7 miles, and I didn't see another car after that point. Just pines, boulders, and the occasional chipmunk darting across the road. I got to the campground just before sunset. There were maybe 10 campsites spread far apart, with basic metal fire rings and wooden picnic tables. A small brown sign near the entrance said, Eagle Lake Campground, with faded white letters. No one else was there. I picked a spot near the far end, with a little slope leading down to the lake, about 50 yards away. It was peaceful, silent really, no wind, no birds, just the soft crunch of my boots in the dirt and the sound of water lapping the shore in the distance. I set up my tent quickly, rolled out my sleeping bag, and stacked some firewood I'd brought. I ate cold pasta salad from a Tupperware container, cracked open a beer, and sat by the fire as it got dark. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt so relaxed. No streetlights, no sirens, no phones. Just trees, water, and the occasional hoot of an owl. The first night went by without anything strange. I heard raccoons rummaging through the bushes, but I'd packed my food in the truck, so they didn't get anything. The air got cold around 2 a.m., and I had to zip up tight in my sleeping bag. When I woke up, the sun was already over the trees, and everything was soaked in dew. I made coffee on my little camp stove, warmed up some eggs and bacon, and ate while watching the lake turn gold in the morning light. The second day, I hiked around the lake. The trail was barely visible in some places, more like a game trail than an official path. I didn't mind. I had my compass and water bottle, and I made mental notes of landmarks as I walked. An old fallen pine, a mossy rock shaped like a chair, a small clearing with wildflowers still hanging on. The lake wasn't that big, maybe 1.5 miles around, but the woods were thick and I lost the trail a couple times. I kept calm and retraced my steps each time. I didn't want to be one of those guys who ends up on the news because they wandered off into the forest unprepared. I spent the afternoon fishing off a flat rock near the north end of the lake, caught 2 small trout and let them go. I wasn't hungry enough to clean them. Just casting and reeling was enough to keep me happy. The whole place felt untouched, like time moved slower there. That night, after dinner, I sat by the fire again and listened to the sounds of the woods. A breeze started up around 9, and I could hear branches creaking overhead. I was used to that wind making the trees groan, dry needles brushing against each other. But just before I turned in, I heard something different. It sounded like a branch snapping, but heavier, closer, like a thick stick breaking under weight. I froze, listening hard. I didn't hear anything else. No footsteps, no rustling. I figured it was a deer, maybe even a bear. I'd seen signs on the road warning about bears in the area. I got my flashlight and swept it in wide arcs around the trees. Nothing. The light caught thousands of tiny eyes in the underbrush, bugs mostly. Nothing big. I made sure all my food was locked in the truck, threw some dirt on the fire, and crawled into my tent. I had trouble sleeping that night. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something outside, a shuffle of dirt, a twig snapping. Once, what sounded like a quiet exhale, like someone breathing out sharply through their nose. I lay there in the dark, heart thudding, listening. But every time I unzipped the tent and looked outside, I saw nothing. No movement, just trees and shadows. I told myself it was animals. It had to be, maybe a curious raccoon or a fox. Nothing to worry about. By morning, I'd convinced myself I'd overreacted. I boiled some oatmeal, drank more coffee, and planned to hike up the ridge behind the lake. There was no trail, but the slope wasn't too steep, and I wanted to see the view from the top. I packed a day bag with water, jerky, a small first aid kit, compass, and my knife just in case. It took me about an hour to get up there, climbing over logs and ducking under branches. When I finally reached the top, I could see the entire lake below, glinting in the sun like a sheet of glass. Beyond it, just endless forest. No roads, no buildings, not a single sign of civilization. That's when I saw something that gave me pause. Across the lake, near my campsite, I saw something move. It was small from that distance. Couldn't make out details. Just a figure. Upright, dark clothes walking along the treeline. I didn't know if it was a person or not. Maybe it was just the shadows playing tricks. But I watched it for a few minutes. It moved slowly back and forth along the trees. Then it stopped and stood still. I stared at it until my eyes watered. It didn't move again. I looked away to rub my eyes, and when I looked back, it was gone. I climbed back down faster than I'd gone up. By the time I got back to my camp, I was sweating. Everything looked the same. Nothing disturbed. Cooler still closed. Tent untouched. I checked inside the truck. Everything was in place. I tried to laugh it off, but the knot in my stomach didn't go away. I stayed close to camp the rest of the day, fishing from the shore and trying to calm myself down. The sun dipped early behind the ridge, and the air got cold again. I built the fire bigger than usual. That night, the sounds came back. More footsteps. Closer. I could hear something brushing against the side of my tent around midnight. Just a light drag, like a hand moving along the fabric. I held my breath and waited. It stopped. A few minutes later, I heard something metallic. My truck's door handle being tested. Click, then silence. I unzipped the tent just an inch and peeked out. My truck was 20 feet away. I could barely see it in the moonlight. Nothing moved. I got out slowly, gripping my flashlight and my knife. I walked to the truck. Nothing was out of place. No footprints. I opened the door and got my phone, trying to get a signal. Still nothing. I thought about leaving right then and there, but it was pitch black, and that gravel road was tough to drive even in daylight. I didn't want to risk it. I got in the truck and locked the doors. Slept there the rest of the night. The next morning, I decided to pack up. I'd only planned to stay one more night anyway, but I didn't feel safe anymore. I took my time loading everything. I scanned the woods constantly, listening, watching. When I lifted the tent, I found something underneath that stopped me cold. A footprint, barefoot, human, pressed into the soft dirt under where the tent had been. It wasn't mine. I'd worn boots the whole time. It was narrow, long, and left by someone with no shoes. I stared at it for a long time. Then I found another one, and another, a small trail of them leading toward the trees. I didn't stop to investigate. I threw the last of my gear into the truck and got out of there. The road felt longer going back, every turn making me glance in the mirrors. I didn't breathe easy until I hit pavement again and saw another car headed the opposite direction. I didn't report it. Who would I tell? What would I even say? No one had broken into anything. Nothing was taken. No crime committed. Just a footprint. Just noises. Just shadows. But I knew what I felt. I knew I wasn't alone out there. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still hike, still fish, but I go to places with other people now. Somewhere with cell signal. Somewhere with rangers nearby. I don't care if it's less peaceful. I'd rather hear music blasting from another site than sit alone. I had been planning a solo camping trip for months. It was the summer of 2022, and I had just finished a long, exhausting job project that kept me tied to a desk for too many hours every week. I needed a break, not a trip to a city or some popular beach. What I wanted was real quiet, somewhere deep in nature with no people around. I grew up hiking and camping with my dad in northern Oregon, so I figured I'd go back there. I found an area on an old Forest Service map, near the Wallowa Mountains, tucked far away from the regular trails. It wasn't a known campground, just some clearings near an old logging road. It looked perfect. I left early on a Thursday morning in July, driving my old 4Runner with a packed cooler, gear, and enough food for 5 days. I wanted to really disconnect, and I made sure my phone was off once I passed the last bit of town that had reception. The dirt road that led into the forest was rough, washed out in places, deep ruts, overgrown with brush, but I took it slow. After about an hour of driving through thick trees and narrow turns, I found the spot I'd marked on the map. It was a flat, grassy area just off the road, with tall pines all around and a creek running about 50 yards away. It looked like no one had camped there in years. I parked, stepped out, and just stood there for a minute. All I could hear were birds, the wind in the trees, and the creek. The air smelled like pine and earth, rich and clean. Felt right. I set up my tent near the treeline for shade, got a small fire pit ready, and laid out my gear neatly. I was careful with everything. I didn't want to attract animals, so I strung up my food in a bear bag and kept all scented items sealed. The first night was peaceful. I cooked some beans and rice over the fire, sat on a log, and watched the sun go down. As the sky turned dark, I laid back on my sleeping pad and looked at the stars. There were so many, bright and clear without any light pollution. I fell asleep listening to the creek and the wind. It was exactly what I'd hoped for. The next day, I went exploring. I packed a small bag with water, a knife, some snacks, and a compass. I followed the creek upstream, climbing over rocks and ducking under branches, enjoying the quiet. After a couple hours, I found what looked like an old trail, maybe a game path, maybe something left from logging. It ran parallel to the creek for a bit, then veered into the woods. I followed it out of curiosity. About a mile in, I found an old structure. Not a cabin, not really. It looked more like a storage shed or a ranger outpost, long abandoned. The roof was half caved in, and the wood was dark with rot. No windows, just a small door that hung crooked on rusted hinges. I didn't go inside, just looked around. There were old, rusty tools lying in the weeds nearby, and something that might have been a fuel canister. It was weird, but not scary, just part of the forest's history. Still, I made a mental note of the direction I'd come from. I didn't want to get lost. That night, things felt a little different. Nothing obvious, just a sense that the air was heavier. It was warmer, too, and the wind had died down. The forest felt still. I tried to shake it off. I'd spent enough time in the woods to know that sometimes it just feels that way, no big reason, just weather and mood. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of twigs snapping. Not close, but not far either. Probably 50 feet away. I lay still, listening. It was slow, not the quick rustling of a deer or the heavy thump of a bear. More like footsteps, but I told myself it wasn't. It had to be some animal. I waited, holding my breath, but after a few minutes it stopped. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I checked around the camp. Nothing was touched. My bear bag was still hanging, the fire pit untouched. There weren't even any tracks. I figured maybe a raccoon had been walking around, or a coyote. I made some oatmeal, drank coffee, and sat in the sun for a while. I thought about heading back that day, but part of me didn't want to leave just because of one weird night. I wasn't hurt. Nothing was broken. It was probably nothing. That afternoon, I decided to go a different direction along the creek. Downstream this time. I didn't go far, maybe half a mile. I found a fallen tree that crossed the water like a bridge and sat there, feet dangling, just listening. But even then, something felt off. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no rustling, just stillness. I tried to ignore it, but it kept creeping into the back of my mind. I turned around and walked back to camp before sunset. I kept the fire going late that night. The sound from the night before had stuck with me. I sat with my back to a tree, facing the woods, just watching. I had my headlamp on, but I kept it dim. Around midnight again, I heard the same sound. Twigs, crunching, slow, deliberate, closer this time. I held my breath, trying not to move. I couldn't see anything in the trees, but I knew something was out there. It moved for about a minute, then went silent again. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat there until the sky started turning gray, and the birds finally started singing again. That morning, I made the decision to leave. I wasn't scared in the way people think of fear, like screaming or running. I was just uneasy, like something wasn't right and I didn't want to find out what. I packed everything carefully, making sure not to leave trash or mess behind. I tied my gear down and started driving out. About a mile down the dirt road, I saw something that made me stop. On the side of the road, where the brush thinned out a little, there were tire tracks. Not mine. I had been the only one out there, no other vehicles, no signs of people. These tracks were fresh. I got out to look, crouched down, and could see they were from a truck, deep treads wider than my own. They came in from a different direction, through the woods, not the main road. And they stopped. Just stopped, about 30 feet from the road. No turnaround, no backing out. Just ended. I felt cold all over. Whoever drove in had walked the rest of the way. I looked at the tree line and realized I couldn't see into the woods at all. Too dense. I got back in the 4Runner and didn't stop again until I hit pavement 2 hours later. I drove to the nearest ranger station, one of the small ones that act more like information posts than law enforcement. I told the ranger that I'd seen tracks near a primitive area and asked if there had been any vehicles reported missing or break-ins. He just shook his head and said no, but thanked me for the info. I didn't give a lot of details. I just wanted to leave. That night, back at home, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound outside made me tense up. I kept thinking about the quiet footsteps, the tire tracks, and that sense of being watched. I started replaying the trip in my head, trying to remember if I'd seen anything out of place before I heard the sounds at night. I remembered the old shed and the tools lying around, the weird silence by the creek, and how it all just started to feel wrong. A week later, I got a call from a private number. I didn't answer. No message. Then it happened again. Twice. Always silent, always from a blocked number. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just spam, but I couldn't stop thinking about the tracks. Someone else had been out there, not camping, not hiking, just watching. I never went back to that spot. I still go camping, but I stay in more public areas now. I like hearing other people nearby. I like seeing tents and RVs and campfires in the distance. That solo trip changed the way I see the woods. They're still beautiful, still peaceful, but I don't forget what happened. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't my imagination. Someone was out there. They walked near my camp. They came in from a hidden direction. They didn't take anything. They didn't speak. They just watched. The scariest part is not knowing what they wanted. Maybe nothing. Maybe they were just curious. Or maybe they were waiting for something. I'll never know. But I know this, something was off, and I trusted that feeling just in time. If I had stayed one more night, I think it would have ended very differently. Now, whenever I'm out in the woods, I listen more. I pay attention to the quiet. And if something doesn't feel right, I leave. Because sometimes the real danger in the forest isn't the animals or the weather. It's the people you don't see. I had been looking forward to the trip for months. Work had been draining me every day, and I needed a break from the noise, the screens, and the constant buzz of people. I wanted to be alone, surrounded by trees and silence. So when I finally booked a few days off work, I didn't hesitate. I packed up my gear, checked the weather, and chose a small, lesser-known spot in north-central Oregon, just past the Deschutes National Forest. It was an area I hadn't visited before, but I had read online that it had good, isolated campsites with a mix of woods, creeks, and some small rock formations. Not too far from civilization if something went wrong, but far enough that I could be completely alone. I left on a Thursday morning in early October. The leaves had started to change, but the cold hadn't fully settled in yet. The drive took me about 4 hours. I stopped once for gas and snacks, then turned off the highway and followed a narrow gravel road for another 30 minutes. The last stretch got rough. The trees closed in tightly around the path, and the further I went, the fewer tire tracks I saw. Eventually, I parked where the road stopped and slung my pack over my shoulder. I had to hike another mile or so into the forest to get to the site I had picked on the map. The hike was peaceful, just birds and the wind in the trees. I had my GPS, printed trail notes, and a small compass just in case. After about 40 minutes, I found the clearing I had chosen. It wasn't a marked campsite, just a flat, dry patch between tall pines with some rocks and fallen logs nearby. A small creek ran about 150 feet to the west, and there was a steep hill behind me that helped block any wind. It was perfect. I set up my tent, made sure everything was secure, and gathered some wood for the fire. The sun was already starting to lower behind the trees by the time I finished. I sat by the fire with a cup of instant soup and listened to the woods. No voices, no cars, just the crackle of the fire and the slow sound of running water nearby. I remember thinking it was exactly what I needed. That night was calm, I slept better than I had in weeks. I didn't hear anything strange, just the usual nighttime forest sounds. An owl in the distance, maybe a raccoon rustling through the underbrush. Nothing unusual. I woke up a couple of times to shift around on the sleeping pad, but I never felt nervous. The woods felt still, like they were holding me. The second day, I went exploring. I followed the creek upstream for a while, found a dead tree full of woodpecker holes, and saw a few deer in the distance. I didn't see any other people. No tents, no garbage, not even boot prints. I kind of liked that. I was really alone out there, and it made everything feel more real. I collected more wood, made myself some coffee on my little stove, and took notes in the journal I brought. I wrote about the way the sun hit the trees in the afternoon, how quiet it was, and how I had barely thought about work once. It was all exactly what I had hoped for. I even took a few pictures on my phone, though I left it on airplane mode to save the battery. There wasn't any signal out there anyway. That night, things felt different. It wasn't anything big at first. I just felt a little more alert, like my body was tuning into something. The wind had picked up, and the fire didn't feel as warm as it had the night before. I kept thinking I was hearing small noises off in the woods, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing. No movement, no shapes in the dark. Just silence. I convinced myself it was animals. Maybe raccoons again. Maybe even a bear, though I had hung my food bag high and far from camp, and I had made sure not to cook near my tent. Still, I felt uneasy. I stayed up later that night, letting the fire burn low. I kept the hatchet next to me, just in case. I didn't hear anything large moving around, but something didn't feel right. Eventually, I went into the tent and zipped it shut. I left the hatchet inside, next to my sleeping bag, and lay there for a while just listening. The wind kept blowing. Occasionally, I heard leaves crunching, but nothing close. I drifted off sometime after midnight. I woke up suddenly around 3 a.m. It wasn't a sound that woke me. It was silence. Everything had gone still. The wind was gone, and even the creek sounded distant, like it had moved away from me. I sat up in the tent and held my breath. There was a tight feeling in my chest. I listened for anything. Footsteps, breathing, a branch cracking, but there was nothing. Just complete, solid silence. It felt like being underwater. I grabbed the flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. I didn't shine it outside right away. I just listened. Then I stepped out and turned the light on. The beam hit the trees and lit up a small circle of forest. Everything looked the same, my fire pit, the logs, my chair, but the air felt wrong, heavy. I turned the flashlight slowly in a circle, scanning the trees. No eyes, no shapes, nothing. But when I turned the light toward the path that led down to the creek, I saw something strange. A line of disturbed leaves. It looked like someone had walked through the underbrush recently. Not an animal, there were no paw prints, no digging. It was a long, narrow path through the leaves, like someone dragging their feet. It started near the creek and led straight toward my camp, then curved slightly off to the side, maybe 20 feet from my tent. I froze. I followed the path with the flashlight, careful not to move too fast. The trail stopped near a tree just beyond the edge of my camp. I stepped closer. The leaves had been pushed aside, and I could see dirt where the ground had been disturbed. I crouched down to look. It was a footprint, a human footprint, barefoot. I stood up fast and backed away, nearly tripping over a rock behind me. I shined the flashlight around again, but I didn't see anything. No one was there, just the footprint, the line through the leaves, and that thick, horrible silence. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the tent with my flashlight and hatchet, watching the woods. I kept expecting to see someone step out from behind a tree, but no one came. The air stayed quiet, too quiet, like the forest was waiting for something. When the sun finally came up, I stood and stretched my legs. My knees were stiff from sitting all night. I checked the ground again. The footprint was still there. I followed the path down to the creek. The trail disappeared a few feet before the water. I couldn't find where it came from. No other tracks. No boots, no bags, no signs of camping. Just that one barefoot print and the line through the leaves. I packed up my gear right after that. I didn't even make breakfast. I just shoved everything into my pack and took down the tent. My hands were shaking the whole time. I kept turning around, checking the woods. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. The hike back to the car felt twice as long. I kept thinking I heard footsteps behind me, but every time I stopped, the sound stopped too. I kept looking over my shoulder. My heart wouldn't slow down. When I finally got to the car, I threw my pack in the back and locked the doors. I sat there for a few minutes just breathing. Then I started the engine and drove back down the gravel road. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. Even then, I didn't feel safe. It took me a long time to stop thinking about that footprint. I reported it to the local ranger station when I got home, just in case. I didn't know what to say exactly. I told them I saw signs that someone might have been in the area, walking barefoot at night. They said they'd check it out, but I never heard anything back. I tried to forget it, to convince myself it was just some odd hiker or maybe a local wandering around. But that doesn't make sense. Who hikes into the woods barefoot in October, doesn't bring any gear, and walks right up to someone's tent in the middle of the night without ever saying a word? It's been over a year now. I haven't been back to that part of the forest. I still camp, but I choose sites with other people nearby. I bring better locks for the tent. I check the ground around me more carefully, and I don't sleep without the hatchet close by. Whatever was out there that night didn't want to be seen. It didn't try to take anything. It didn't make a sound. It just got close enough to let me know I wasn't alone. And that was enough. It was late September when I decided to go camping alone in the northern part of Colorado, close to the border near Wyoming. I had just finished a long freelance project that kept me at my desk for almost 6 weeks straight, and I needed to get out. I wanted somewhere quiet, not crowded, no cell service, and not too touristy. I looked over a couple of maps, read some old hiking forums, and picked a national forest area that seemed remote enough without being completely off the grid. It wasn't part of a popular national park, just forest land that hikers and hunters sometimes used. I packed up my truck with all the usual gear, tent, sleeping bag, water purifier, freeze-dried meals, first aid kit, bear spray, everything I knew I'd need for a solo trip. I had done solo camping before, but this would be the longest. 5 nights planned in total, deep in the woods, completely by myself. The trailhead was 2 hours off the main highway, mostly dirt roads with potholes and washboard stretches. I got there late in the morning and parked in a small gravel clearing surrounded by pine trees. There were no other cars. I started hiking in with a 45-pound pack, and after about 4 hours of steady climbing, I found a small plateau with a view of the valley below. The trees were thinner up there, and I could see for miles. I picked a flat spot next to a boulder and set up camp. I had enough daylight left to cook dinner, collect firewood, and make sure everything was set up properly. The wind was calm, skies clear, and I didn't see or hear a single person all day, just birds, squirrels, and the rustle of leaves. That first night was peaceful. I sat by the fire until it burned down, then crawled into my sleeping bag and fell asleep fast. It got cold after midnight, but nothing unexpected. I woke up once to pee and noticed how insanely dark it was. No moon that night. My flashlight barely cut through the black. I didn't hear anything odd, just the wind moving through the trees. The second day, I hiked further up a ridge with just a day pack, leaving most of my gear at camp. I found a small stream that I marked on my GPS and filtered water. I didn't see any sign of other people, no trash, no boot prints, no broken branches. The woods felt untouched. That's what I'd wanted. On the way back, I took a longer route around the ridge and made it back to camp just before sunset. My firewood stash was untouched. My tent was how I left it. Everything seemed normal. I felt good, tired but good. The second night started like the first. I ate, sat by the fire, listened to the forest settle into night. But around 1 a.m., I woke up to a sound I couldn't place. It was faint, but definitely not wind or animals. It sounded like a dull thump, not fast, not frantic, just a single thump maybe every 30 seconds or so. I sat up in my sleeping bag and stayed quiet. The sound kept going for another couple minutes, then stopped. I unzipped my tent and poked my head out, but couldn't see anything in the dark. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but there was nothing. I figured it was a tree branch or something falling, maybe a small rock slide on the ridge. It didn't happen again that night. The third day, I stuck close to camp. I was a little uneasy from the sound, but not enough to leave. I walked in circles around the area, checking the trees and rocks to see if anything had fallen, but I didn't find anything fresh. No tracks, no disturbed leaves, nothing out of place. I boiled water for coffee, wrote in a notebook, and gathered more firewood. It was warmer that day, so I rinsed off with cold water from my bottle and let the sun dry me off. It felt good to just sit and do nothing. I didn't hear the sound again all day. That night, though, the sound came back. This time, it was closer. It woke me up again, around 2 a.m. Thump, then a pause. Another thump. It wasn't rhythmic, more like someone walking slowly, one heavy step at a time. I sat there for probably 20 minutes, heart pounding, trying to decide what to do. I didn't want to go out of the tent, but I didn't want to stay still either. I finally grabbed my headlamp and my bear spray, unzipped the tent, and shined the light in all directions. Again, nothing. The sound stopped the second I opened the tent. I stayed up another hour, just sitting by the fire pit with the headlamp on, trying to listen. Nothing came back. In the morning, I checked the area more thoroughly. I widened my search circle, looking for footprints or broken branches. But the ground was mostly dry and covered in pine needles, which don't hold prints well. I thought maybe an elk or moose had wandered close, but the sound had felt deliberate, like bipedal. Still, I had no proof. I thought about hiking back out, but I had 2 nights left, and I didn't want to feel like I'd chickened out. I told myself I was being paranoid. That 4th day, I didn't stray far. I collected more wood than usual and built a larger fire. I made sure all my food was hung up properly, bear safe. I even set out a few small rocks in a circle around the tent, thinking maybe I could hear if something disturbed them in the night. I sat near the fire until late, until the wood burned low and the stars were out in full. Then I climbed into the tent and kept my headlamp close by. That night was worse than any other. I heard the thumping again, but this time there was more to it. I heard branches cracking, couple heavy footfalls, not close but not far either. Then silence. Then something brushed against the tent. Not hard, but enough to make the nylon ripple. I held my breath. I didn't move. I didn't even want to breathe too loud. The brush happened again on the other side of the tent. Then I heard what sounded like slow breathing. Not mine. Outside the tent. Just for a second. Then nothing. I stayed awake until morning. I didn't sleep at all. As soon as the sun rose, I packed my gear in record time. I didn't even eat. I shoved everything into my pack, collapsed the tent, grabbed my bear spray and knife, and started hiking back toward the trailhead. I looked over my shoulder the whole way. I felt watched, but I didn't hear anything following me. It took almost 5 hours to get back to my truck because I was moving fast and didn't stop for brakes. When I reached the gravel clearing, I froze. My truck door was open. I hadn't left it that way. I was sure of it. I always lock it. Always. I ran to it and looked inside. Nothing was missing. My spare gear was there, my maps, my phone charger, even a bag of snacks I'd left behind. But the door had definitely been opened. I checked the ground around the truck, and there were footprints. Boot prints. Not mine. I wear size 11 trail runners, and these were bigger. Maybe size 13. And heavier. The tread pattern was different too. Not hiking boots. They looked like work boots. I couldn't tell how fresh they were, but they looked recent. I didn't waste any more time. I got in, locked the doors, and drove. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway. I didn't have cell signal until another 20 miles, and when I did, I called my brother just to talk, to calm myself down. I didn't tell him everything, just that I'd cut the trip short. When I got home, I went over everything in my head. I didn't tell anyone the full story for a long time. No one would believe it. Nothing technically happened. I never saw a person. Nothing was stolen. but something was out there. Someone, watching me, getting close to my tent, touching it, opening my truck. That wasn't an animal. That wasn't just the woods being creepy. That was a person who didn't want to be seen. After that trip, I stopped solo camping. I still go out with friends sometimes, but never alone. I started locking my truck even at remote trailheads. I got a satellite GPS with an emergency beacon. I still think about that trip sometimes, especially the sound of that slow breathing just outside the tent. I know what I heard. I know someone was out there, and I know they were close enough to reach out and touch the tent. They just didn't. I don't know why. I never thought I'd find myself alone in a remote cabin in the middle of nowhere, but that's exactly where I ended up. It was meant to be a quiet retreat, a break from the hustle of city life, a chance to unwind. I'd been under a lot of stress lately, work piling up, personal stuff weighing me down, and I needed a way to disconnect. I figured a cabin out in the woods would be perfect. No distractions, just peace and quiet. At least that's what I thought when I first looked at the pictures online. The cabin was located deep in the forest of the Adirondacks, far enough from the nearest town that it seemed like the perfect place to be off the grid. The owner, a man named Paul, had given me the keys with a brief rundown of the place. He seemed nice enough, but there was something a little off about the whole situation. The cabin didn't look like the kind of place you'd expect to see in a tourist brochure. It was old, the kind of place that had been around for decades and probably hadn't seen many updates in the last 20 years. The photos didn't show the dark corners or the worn wooden floors, but I didn't mind. I thought it would add to the charm. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already dipping low behind the tree line. The road leading up to the cabin was a dirt track, barely wide enough for my car. The trees on either side seemed to press in, their twisted branches creating a canopy overhead. The forest here was dense, the kind of place where the shadows felt deeper than they should, even in the daylight. As I parked in front of the cabin, I noticed how quiet everything was. No wind rustling through the trees, no birds calling out. It was an eerie silence, the kind you don't notice until you do. I grabbed my bag and walked up to the front door. The wood was weathered and cracked, but it still had a certain rustic charm. I slipped the key into the lock, the metal scraping against the frame, and stepped inside. The cabin smelled like old wood and something faintly musty, like it hadn't been aired out in a while. A small living room greeted me, furnished with mismatched chairs, a worn-out couch, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The place wasn't filthy, but it was clear no one had really taken care of it. The kitchen was off to the right, with a small wooden table and a stove that looked like it might fall apart if you leaned on it too hard. I set my things down and took a moment to just absorb the space. It felt different than I expected. There was an odd sense of isolation here that I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just that the cabin was far from civilization. It was as if the woods themselves were closing in around me, like the trees were watching. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination, and started unpacking. I'd come here to relax, not to get spooked by the setting. The first night was uneventful. I made myself a simple meal, sat by the fire for a while, and then went to bed. The bed was old, too, the frame creaking under me as I lay down, but it was comfortable enough. I fell asleep easily, the silence of the forest outside lulling me into a deep rest. But that was when things started to feel off. The first time I woke up in the night, I thought it was just a bad dream. My room was cold, the air thick with stillness. I could hear the sound of the wind rustling outside, but there was something else too, a soft thud, like something hitting the cabin's walls. I told myself it was just a tree branch, the kind that might fall when the wind picked up. But then the noise came again. Thud, thud. I lay still, my eyes wide open, staring into the darkness of the room. My heart started to beat faster. I had always been the kind of person who could rationalize things, who could explain away every little noise. But this was different. I told myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing. But then it came again. Thud, thud. I didn't get up to check. I don't know why. Maybe I was too scared. or maybe I was too tired to move. Instead, I just pulled the covers tighter around me and closed my eyes, trying to block out the sound. Eventually, I fell back to sleep, but the noise kept echoing in my mind, even in my dreams. The next morning, I went outside to get some fresh air, hoping the daylight would chase away the unease that had crept in. The sun was shining, the air crisp and cool. It was a perfect day for a hike, so I decided to take a walk through the woods. The trail started just behind the cabin, winding through the trees. It wasn't a marked trail, just something that looked like it had been used by people who knew the area. I walked for hours trying to clear my head, but the unease stayed with me. There was something about the forest here that felt wrong. It wasn't the beauty of the place. It was the way the trees seemed to close in around me, the way the silence felt like it was pressing down on my chest. I tried to push the feeling aside, reminding myself that I was being irrational, but it was hard to shake. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was beginning to set. The sky had turned orange and pink, the fading light casting long shadows across the land. As I walked up to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it when I left, but now it was open, just a crack. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a rush of adrenaline. I stepped inside slowly, my footsteps barely making a sound on the wooden floor. Everything seemed normal at first, no signs of anything being disturbed. But then I noticed something on the table in the kitchen. A small, crumpled piece of paper. I didn't remember seeing it there before. I picked it up and unfolded it, my hands trembling. The note was simple, written in blocky, uneven handwriting. Asterisk, leave now or it will be worse. Asterisk. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, my mind racing. I had no idea what this meant. Who had left the note? Had someone been inside the cabin while I was gone? I looked around the room again, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints in the dust, no broken windows. Nothing that suggested anyone had entered. But that note, it felt wrong, like a warning, and suddenly I wasn't sure I wanted to stay here any longer. But the thing was, I wasn't about to just leave. I wasn't going to let fear control me. I'd come here to get away, and I wasn't going to let some strange note make me run. Instead, I locked the door and spent the evening trying to convince myself that it was just a prank, a random act by someone who thought it would be funny to mess with me. That night, I locked every window and every door, double-checking to make sure everything was secure. I didn't hear any strange noises, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I stayed up late, watching the fire crackle in the hearth, trying to ignore the gnawing sense of dread creeping up on me. It wasn't until the middle of the night that I heard it again. The noise. Thud, thud, thud. I jumped out of bed, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound was coming from outside the cabin, just on the other side of the wall. I crept over to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peer out. But there was nothing. No movement, no shadow. Just the dark, empty forest. The thuds continued, growing louder, more insistent. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and rushed outside, desperate to find the source of the noise. The air was cold, the ground damp beneath my boots. I shined the light around the yard, scanning every corner, every tree. But there was nothing. The forest was as still as ever. I walked around the cabin, checking the perimeter. That's when I saw it. Near the back of the cabin, where the woods got even denser, there was something strange on the ground. It looked like footprints, large, heavy prints, as if someone had been walking around the cabin, leaving marks in the soft earth. I followed the prints as they led deeper into the woods. My breath quickened as I moved further from the cabin, the darkness swallowing me whole. The noise had stopped, but I still felt like I wasn't alone. Every rustling leaf, every crack of a twig made my heart race. Eventually, the footprints led me to a clearing, and in the center of it, there was something that made my stomach drop. A pile of logs, stacked neatly, almost like a cairn. But it wasn't just logs. It looked like something had been placed there, something unsettling. I couldn't bring myself to get too close, but I could see enough to know it wasn't just debris from the woods. There was something off about it. And then I heard it again. Thud, thud. The noise was so close now, it was as if it was coming from right behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight into the dark. But again, there was nothing. Just the trees, the silence, and that damn feeling of being watched. I turned and ran back toward the cabin, my feet pounding against the ground. I didn't stop until I was safely inside, the door locked behind me. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay here any longer. The next morning, I packed my bags, my hands shaking as I shoved everything into the car. I didn't even bother to check the cabin one last time. I just wanted to get out. As I drove away, the forest shrinking behind me in the rearview mirror, I felt a strange sense of relief. The tension. I was 31 the year I decided to disappear for a while. Not from anything dramatic, not from the law or someone chasing me. I was just tired. I'd worked construction for most of my 20s, long shifts under the sun, dealing with supervisors who barely remembered your name. My knees were giving out and my back felt older than my dad's. So when I got laid off in late spring of 2019, I didn't look for new work right away. I took it as a sign. I had a bit of money saved, not a lot, but enough to float for a few months if I lived cheap. A guy I knew, Rick, used to hunt in northern Wisconsin, and he told me about a place he'd stayed in, an old hunting cabin near Lac View Desert, barely an hour from the Michigan border. He said it was rustic, had no cell service, and nobody went near it after the snow melted because there wasn't much game around. It belonged to a friend of his uncle's or something. He said I could probably rent it for next to nothing if I called the owner directly. So I did. The guy didn't care much. He said if I wanted to give him $400 for the month and not burn it down, the key was under a cement frog by the door. So I packed up my old blue Tacoma with canned food, fishing gear, some tools, and a couple of paperbacks. I didn't bring a laptop. No internet. That was the point. I was gonna go off the grid for a while. Just get away from all the noise. I drove up in early June. It took me almost 8 hours from my apartment in Madison. I'd never been that far north before, and the last hour of driving was nothing but trees. The paved roads turned into cracked gravel, and eventually into what felt like trails. I passed a few old houses that looked like no one had lived in them since the 90s. Faded mailboxes with names I couldn't pronounce, old trucks rusting into the earth. The cabin was farther out than I thought. It wasn't even marked. I had to turn off onto a trail that was barely wide enough for my truck. The trees were so close they brushed the sides as I drove in. When I finally got there, it was smaller than I expected. One story, maybe 20 feet wide. It had a screened porch out front and a metal chimney sticking up from the back like a bent finger. The woods around it were thick and alive. The kind of alive that's almost loud. Insects, birds, whined through leaves. I liked it immediately. I found the frog, got the key, and opened the door. The inside smelled like wood smoke and old leather. There was one big room with a stone fireplace, a dusty green couch, a table with 2 chairs, and a kitchen area with a propane stove and a dented fridge that didn't work. A narrow hallway led to a single bedroom and a small bathroom with no mirror and a dry toilet I'd have to empty into a compost bin outside. There was a small window in the bedroom that looked out toward the woods behind the cabin. I set my bags down, cracked a beer, and sat on the porch. The only sounds were birds, the creak of trees, and the distant buzzing of bugs. No cars, no people. It was perfect. The first few days were peaceful. I spent my mornings fishing at a small stream I'd found about a half-mile from the cabin. I'd pack a sandwich, bring a folding chair, and sit by the water for hours. I didn't catch much, but I didn't care. I wasn't there for that. I'd read a lot, took naps, cooked beans and rice on the propane stove. Once or twice, I saw deer in the distance, and one morning I spotted a black bear, just lumbering across the path, not bothering with me. I kept my food sealed tight after that. By the second week, though, things started to shift a little. Not anything big, not at first. Just small details that didn't feel right. The first thing was the footprints. There was a clearing out behind the cabin, maybe 30 feet from the back door. I used it as a spot to dump compost and trash. One morning, I walked out there with a bucket of food scraps, and I saw boot prints in the dirt. Not mine. These were deep, with a square heel and a thick tread. I wore sneakers or sandals every day, nothing that would leave a print like that. And these were fresh, pressed into the damp earth like someone had walked through just that morning. I looked around, called out once, but of course there was no answer. Just trees and brush. That afternoon, I walked the perimeter of the property. There wasn't any fence or anything, but I figured maybe someone had been hiking. It was public land past a certain point. Still, it didn't sit right. I didn't sleep well that night. The next few days were quiet again. I tried to forget about it. Then on Thursday, I went to grab one of my tackle boxes from under the porch, and it was gone. I was sure I'd put it back. I remembered placing it beside the bucket with extra fishing line. Now it was just gone. I thought maybe I'd left it by the stream, but when I walked down there, nothing. I checked all around the cabin. Nothing. I kept my truck locked, but I checked that too. Nothing. Now I started to get that feeling. You know, the one. Like someone's been in your space. Like the air has changed and doesn't belong to you anymore. That night, I sat up late, reading on the porch with a lantern. I kept listening for sounds, for movement. A few times I thought I heard something. Sticks cracking, a low shuffle in the trees, but it could have been anything. Could have been a raccoon. Could have been the wind. But the next morning, I found something that made it all feel real. On the window outside the bedroom, on the outside, was a greasy handprint. Full-sized, right in the center of the glass. Like someone had leaned forward and pressed their palm flat against it. 5 fingers, smudged with dirt or oil. I stood there staring at it for a long time. I hadn't seen or heard a single car since I got there. No visitors, no neighbors, no reason anyone would be out here. It was too far, too hidden. Whoever left that handprint knew I was here. They'd come up close to the cabin. They'd looked inside. That day, I cleaned the rifle I'd brought. I'd only used it once for target practice, but now I loaded it and kept it beside the bed. I didn't sleep well again. Every sound outside made me sit up, heart pounding. 3 days passed. Nothing happened. I didn't go to the stream anymore. I stayed close. I kept the doors locked. I peered out the windows before stepping outside. I told myself maybe it was just a hiker, some random weirdo passing through. But then came the worst night. It started like any other. I ate dinner, just beans and eggs, and sat on the porch until the sun dipped low. The light in the woods went orange, then blue, then gone. I went inside and locked the door. I turned off all the lights and laid in bed with the rifle beside me. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. No loud sound, no dream. Just that sharp, silent kind of waking where your brain tells you something's wrong. The window was open. I never opened that window. It was small, hard to crank, and didn't have a screen. But now it was cracked open an inch, just wide enough to let in cold air. I sat up in bed and stared. The moonlight made the room glow pale blue. My heart thudded like a drum. And then I saw movement. A shape just outside. Not a face, not a clear figure. Just something there, low and hunched. Like someone crouched beside the cabin wall, just beneath the window. Waiting, listening. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just sat frozen, staring at that inch of black space between the window and the frame. I could hear my own breathing, fast and shallow. After what felt like forever, the shape shifted. It stood slowly, like someone pushing up from a crouch. And then it moved away. I didn't hear it walk. I just saw the shadow slide out of view. I didn't sleep. I didn't even blink, I think. I sat up until morning, holding the rifle, eyes locked on that window. When it was finally light, I walked outside. There were more prints in the dirt now. Not just in the clearing, *right outside the window. Deep and messy, same boots. And on the side of the cabin, scratched into the wood with something sharp, was a line. Just a single horizontal gouge, as long as my arm, carved low into the wall. Like someone had dragged a knife or a key straight across it. That was it for me. I packed that day, shoved everything into the truck as fast as I could. I didn't care about cleaning. I didn't care about the trash. I just needed to get out. I didn't even go back to lock the door. I drove until I hit the main road, then farther until I had bars on my phone again. I pulled over in front of a gas station and just sat there, letting my hands stop shaking. I didn't report it. What could I say? That someone was near my cabin? That I saw a shape in the night? There was no proof, no faces, no names. Just tracks and a handprint. I never went back. Later, I told Rick what happened. He said the owner of the cabin didn't want to hear about it. Said the guy was old, didn't care, probably wouldn't even fix the window. That was 6 years ago. Sometimes I still dream about that window, about the inch of open space and the shape crouched outside. I still lock every door and check every window, even if I'm just going to bed in my apartment. I wanted quiet. I wanted to get away from people. But the thing is, you never really know who's out there. You think I was 34 the summer I took 2 weeks off work and went off the grid. It was 2018. I'd been living in Pittsburgh, working tech support for a cybersecurity company, pulling long shifts, dealing with angry customers and barely sleeping. I wasn't exactly falling apart, but I could see the cracks forming. I found the cabin listing on some obscure travel blog. It wasn't Airbnb or any of the big names, just a single post titled "Secluded Getaways. Real isolation for the worn-out mind." It featured a few hidden spots in the Northeast, and the second one caught my eye, an old hunter's cabin up in the Allegheny National Forest, near a place called Elkridge. The listing mentioned no Wi-Fi, no cell service, no electricity, just a generator, a water pump, and silence. That's what sold me. The guy who owned the cabin, a man named Vernon, communicated only through email. He sent me a map, an actual hand-drawn map scanned into a PDF, and told me not to rely on GPS because it would stop working 5 miles before I got close. I liked that. I needed to be unreachable. I needed space from the digital noise. So I paid him half up front through PayPal and set the dates for mid-July. I packed light, a duffel bag of clothes, a few basic tools, some dried food, a propane burner, 2 water jugs, a hatchet, a small survival knife, and my hiking boots. I didn't bother with my laptop, and I left my work phone in a drawer back home. I brought a notebook and a paperback, just in case the quiet got too loud. It was a 5-hour drive north from Pittsburgh. I reached Elkridge around noon, a tiny logging town with maybe 24 buildings and not a single traffic light. I filled up on gas at a rundown station, grabbed a couple more granola bars and a bag of ice, then followed the map Vernon had given me. The road narrowed into a dirt path just past an abandoned ranger station. The map told me to keep going until I passed a small wooden sign that read, "Trespassers will be shot." Then take a left and drive a mile into the trees. That's where I found it. The cabin was exactly as described. Small, maybe 20 feet by 25, with a sagging roof and moss-covered steps leading to a creaky front door. The windows were old and cloudy, like they hadn't been cleaned in years. There was a fire ring out front and a rusted folding chair beside it. The generator sat off to the side under a tarp, humming softly when I flipped it on. Inside, the place was basic. 1 room with a cot, a wood stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a small counter with shelves. A narrow door led to what I guessed was a composting toilet. There was no shower, no fridge. The air inside smelled like dust, wood, and the faintest trace of mildew. I dumped my gear, opened a window, and sat outside for a while. The forest stretched out around me like a wall. Thick trees, no sounds but birds and the occasional rustle of something moving in the underbrush. Felt untouched, and it felt good. The first 2 days were everything I hoped for. I cooked simple meals, wrote in the notebook, took long hikes along barely there animal trails, and listened to the wind move through the trees. At night, the darkness was complete. No streetlights, no distant hum of cars, just blackness and the chorus of insects. I hadn't realized how much I missed that kind of silence until I was surrounded by it. But by the 3rd day, I started noticing things. Small things. Nothing big enough to ring any alarms, not at first. Just details that felt off. The first was the firewood. When I arrived, there was a neat stack beside the cabin. Split, dry, ready to burn. But on the third morning, I noticed a few pieces had been moved. Not taken, just shifted, like someone had grabbed a few logs and set them down again. I thought maybe an animal had knocked them over, but there were no claw marks, no droppings, no sign of anything digging. Then there was the footprint. I found it near the creek about a half-mile from the cabin. Not mine. I was wearing thick-soled hiking boots. This was from a different kind of shoe, worn, thin-soled, maybe a work boot. It was partially smudged in the mud but deep. Someone else had walked through there recently. Still, I told myself not to spiral. It was probably Vernon, the cabin owner, checking on the place. Or maybe a hunter scouting the area. Even if the cabin was remote, it didn't mean I was the only human for miles. That night, I left the generator running a bit later. I didn't like the idea of being watched. I didn't hear anything strange. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept imagining the crunch of footsteps outside, the creak of the front steps. Every gust of wind felt like movement. I finally dozed off sometime after 3 a.m., the flashlight gripped tight in my hand. Day 4, I hiked farther out, toward a ridge that overlooked the valley. It was a clear day, and from up there, I could see for miles, just endless green, hills rolling into the horizon. I sat there for a while, calming down, convincing myself the cabin wasn't being watched, that I'd let my imagination get the best of me. On the way back, I noticed something that stopped me cold. About 200 yards from the cabin, hidden behind a dense patch of brush, was a path. Not an animal trail, a man-made one. Someone had cleared branches, trampled grass. It was recent. I followed it for maybe 20 yards before it curved toward the west and disappeared into thicker trees. I didn't go farther. I got back to the cabin and double-checked the door locks. There weren't many, just a flimsy bolt and a latch, but I wedged a chair under the handle too. I didn't cook that night. I sat in the dark, generator off, waiting. Nothing happened. No knocks, no sounds. But I didn't sleep. Day 5 was when things changed. I woke up to find the folding chair gone, the one outside by the fire ring. I'd left it leaned back against the cabin wall. Now it was just gone. I circled the area for 20 minutes, thinking maybe it got blown over or an animal dragged it. Nothing. Then I checked the fire pit. It had been disturbed. Someone had tried to start a fire. There were small charred twigs in the center, arranged carefully, but never lit. I packed my bag. I didn't care that I had another week booked. I was done. I had the map, I knew the way out, but the road had other plans. I walked the mile back to the dirt road and kept going toward the ranger station where I'd entered. It should have taken me less than 2 hours on foot, but the path was blocked. Trees, big ones, had fallen across the road like they'd been cut. Not storm damage. These were clean breaks. Someone had dropped them with a chainsaw. I backtracked, heart pounding, thinking I must have taken a wrong turn. I hadn't. That's when I noticed something else. At the edge of the fallen trees, nailed into the trunk of one, was a new sign. It wasn't there when I came in. It was a flat wooden board, spray-painted red with crude white letters. Not safe. Go back. I stood there for a long time, not sure if I should laugh or cry. It didn't feel like a prank. Felt like a warning. I turned back toward the cabin, brain racing. Who was out here? Why block the only road in or out? Why now? I didn't go back inside. I grabbed my gear from the porch, stashed food and water in my pack, and decided to hike the ridge trail again. From there, I could maybe spot another way out. Even if I had to bushwhack for hours, I figured I'd eventually hit a road or house. I made it to the ridge before sunset. From up there, I scanned every direction. Then I saw it, movement. Below, maybe 300 yards from the cabin, was a figure. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothes. They weren't walking. They were standing, still, facing the cabin. I didn't move. I watched for 10 minutes. They didn't budge. I crawled back from the ridge on my stomach, heart hammering in my throat. Then I circled wide, staying in the trees until nightfall. I didn't go back to the cabin. I didn't light a fire. I found a spot between 2 boulders and hunkered down, wrapped in my jacket, knife in hand, every twig snap making me flinch. Sometime after midnight, I heard it. The sound of a chainsaw in the distance. Not close, but not far either. Just revving, stopping, then starting again. I stayed frozen. It lasted maybe 5 minutes. Then silence. The next morning, I moved. I followed the sun, heading east, keeping low, staying off trails. I rationed my food, drank from the creek, purified it with iodine tabs. I hiked for hours, legs burning, eyes scanning every direction. I didn't see anyone, but I felt watched, constantly. On the second day of hiking, I finally saw a sign of civilization. A barbed wire fence, rusted and sagging, marking the boundary of what looked like a long abandoned farm. Beyond that was a dirt path, and a mile later I saw the outline of a building, another ranger station, this one intact. I stumbled into the lot, banged on the door until someone opened it. An older guy in uniform stared at me like I was a ghost. I told him I'd been hiking, got lost, needed help. I didn't mention the cabin. Not yet. I never meant to go up there. Not like that. Not with the weather turning like it did. But I couldn't resist. The cabin had been abandoned for years, and it wasn't far from where I lived. Just a few hours' drive into the mountains. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Me, a weekend alone, and a break from the grind of my day-to-day life. But that's not what happened. I'm Adam, 28 years old, and I've always had this thing for old places. Not abandoned houses or anything like that. Just quiet, off-the-beaten-path spots in nature. Somewhere I could disconnect. That was the plan. I'd read about the cabin on some old forum. It was tucked away in the northern reaches of Oregon, in a small, forgotten valley. The description sounded promising. Rustic but livable, with a clear stream nearby. The poster had written, "The peace of isolation is unparalleled." It seemed perfect, maybe too perfect. I packed up my car, just the basics. Some food, a sleeping bag, a few cans of soup, and my camera. I had planned to take some photos for a project I was working on, just documenting things, capturing the rawness of nature. I wasn't expecting much, just a bit of peace and quiet, to be honest. The drive up was long. The road wound through dense forests, twisting in and out of fog, the kind of fog that rolls in and settles deep in the trees, thick and damp. The weather had started to turn as soon as I left the highway, and by the time I hit the gravel road that led to the cabin, the rain had started. It wasn't the torrential kind of rain, just the kind that makes everything feel heavy and gray. The cabin itself was smaller than I expected. It was tucked back in the woods, nestled between a thick wall of evergreens and a fast-moving creek. From the outside, it looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. The windows were clouded with dust, and the porch was cluttered with fallen branches. The wood of the cabin was worn, some planks warped and cracked. The roof had patches where the shingles had been replaced with mismatched ones. But it was still standing, and that was enough for me. I wasn't looking for luxury. Inside, the smell hit me first. It wasn't mold, though. It was something else, something stale and closed off. The air felt thick in my lungs as I stepped inside, and I immediately noticed the dust. It covered everything, the floorboards, the counter, even the old, faded furniture. There was a fireplace, but it hadn't been used in who knows how long. A single chair sat in front of it, tipped over on its side. There was an old table with some broken legs, the kind that had been abandoned in a corner because nobody had cared enough to fix it. I made my way through the cabin, setting my things down near the small kitchen area. It wasn't a full kitchen, just a stove and a sink, but it would do. I unpacked quickly, wanting to get settled before the rain turned into something worse. The storm was picking up, the wind howling outside, shaking the trees and rattling the cabin's structure. By the time I finished setting up, it was dark outside. The first few hours were fine. I made myself some soup, read a little, and went through my photos. The rain didn't let up. It felt good to be out of the city, away from everything. It wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful. Or at least that's what I thought. By the time night had fully settled in, I started to hear sounds outside. Little things at first. The sound of a branch scraping against the side of the cabin, the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. But it wasn't just the wind. I could hear something else too, a slow, rhythmic thudding. I tried to tell myself it was just a tree branch, the kind that swings in the wind, but it wasn't quite right. It was too consistent, too deliberate. I stood up, walked to the window, and peeked through the curtain. The trees outside were swaying, the wind tugging at them, but there was nothing else. No movement, no shapes. I chalked it up to my imagination, the isolation making me paranoid. I went back to my chair and settled in. The thudding stopped for a while, but then, just as I was starting to relax, it came back. This time it was louder, closer, and there was something more to it. I couldn't explain it, but it wasn't just the wind anymore. It sounded like something, or someone, was moving around outside. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I couldn't see anything through the window. It was pitch black outside, just the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the trees. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag, not sure why. I wasn't exactly sure what I was hoping to find. Maybe just some reassurance that I was overthinking things. I opened the front door, my boots crunching on the gravel, and stepped outside, shining the light in a slow arc. I didn't see anything at first, just the darkness, the wind picking up the leaves, swirling them in the air. Then I saw it, a shape dark and indistinct, moving just beyond the tree line. I couldn't tell what it was. It was too far away, but it was moving, slowly, deliberately. It wasn't the wind. I wasn't sure what I was seeing, but I knew that I wasn't alone. My heart started pounding in my chest. I backed up into the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. The sounds outside grew louder, the thudding now turning into a slow, rhythmic banging. It was coming from the side of the cabin, just beneath the window. My breath was coming in shallow gasps. I couldn't figure out what was happening. Was someone out there? Was it an animal? The longer I stood there, the more the fear crept in. Then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. Silence. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. I wasn't sure how long I stayed like that. Maybe minutes, maybe hours, but eventually, the storm subsided, and everything outside went eerily quiet. The next morning, the weather was clear. The rain had stopped, and the sun was breaking through the clouds. I didn't sleep much, but I tried to shake off the anxiety. It had to have been an animal, a bear maybe, or a deer, something that was just curious. I spent the day exploring the area around the cabin, trying to take my mind off the previous night. The forest around me was dense, and the creek that ran nearby was louder than I expected. I even took a few pictures, trying to capture the peace I had come for. But every time I glanced back at the cabin, I felt the lingering unease, like something was watching me, waiting for me to slip up. I didn't want to leave. I wanted to push through it. I'd made the decision to be here, but as night started to fall again, I found myself doubting that decision. The light faded quickly, and the forest around me seemed to grow darker. I didn't want to go back inside, but I knew I had to. The thudding started again as soon as the last light left the sky. But this time I knew exactly what it was. It was a person. Someone had been outside the cabin the entire time. Someone who knew this place. Someone who knew I was here. I locked the doors and windows, grabbed my phone, but there was no signal, no way to reach anyone. I had no choice. I had to wait until morning. I had to survive the night. The banging continued for hours. Each thud made my heart race faster, my skin prickling with fear. I stayed low, listening, waiting, trying not to breathe too loud. The sounds eventually faded again, but I couldn't rest, couldn't sleep. By morning, the storm had passed. The sun rose, casting light over the forest, and for the first time in 2 days, I stepped outside without the fear of being watched. But I knew one thing for sure now. I wasn't coming back to this cabin. The woods were beautiful, peaceful even, but there was something in those trees I couldn't explain. Something that would be there long after I left, and I would never forget the feeling of being hunted. My name's Mason. Back in 2017, I was 28 years old and stuck in a rut I didn't see coming. I just quit my job in Boston. some marketing gig that paid well but had me staring at screens for 12 hours a day. My girlfriend had left a few months earlier, said I was distant, said I was becoming someone she didn't recognize. She was right. That fall, I started to spiral. I drank more, slept during the day, ignored friends, ignored bills. When winter hit, I realized I needed to get out of the city, somewhere cold and quiet. Just me, no distractions. I found a place on an old forum. Somebody was renting out a remote cabin in northern Vermont for cheap. Guy said it had wood heat, a basic kitchen, no Wi-Fi, no cell reception. Sounded perfect. The drive took most of the day. Snow had started falling just north of Montpelier, and by the time I hit the turnoff near a town called Craftsbury, visibility was getting bad. The GPS on my old Subaru gave out 10 miles past the last gas station. I followed the directions I'd printed off, winding through back roads lined with leafless trees and snow-covered stone walls. Every few miles I passed an old barn or a rundown farmhouse, but mostly it was just woods. Dark, wet woods that closed in on both sides like a tunnel. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow dirt road that curved downhill through a birch grove. It looked smaller than I'd expected, single-story, weathered cedar planks, a rusted metal chimney poking out from the roof. There was a small woodshed to the side and a frozen creek just down the slope. The place had a tilted porch with one broken step and a screen door hanging by one hinge. Inside, it was dark and cold. The front room was one big open space with a fireplace, a tiny kitchen tucked into the corner, a table with 2 chairs, and an old couch that looked like it had seen better decades. A hallway led to a single bedroom and a tiny bathroom. The air smelled like mildew and wood smoke. A few spider webs hung in the corners. I lit a fire first thing. Took forever to get going. The logs in the shed were damp and half-rotted, but after enough newspaper and frustration, the flames finally caught. I unpacked my gear, just a duffel bag with clothes, a box of canned food, a few bottles of water, and a flask I'd filled with bourbon for emergencies. I set up my laptop even though there was no Wi-Fi, just to journal or watch movies I downloaded. But mostly I planned to read, right? Maybe go hiking once the weather cleared. The first night was peaceful. I remember that. The fire popped quietly, and snow tapped at the windows like tiny fingers. It was the kind of quiet that made you realize how loud cities were. No cars, no people yelling, just wind and trees. I slept well under a pile of old quilts I found in the bedroom closet. But the peace didn't last. It started the second night. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise. Not a crash or bang, just this slow, rhythmic creaking, like someone walking in circles on the porch. I sat up, heart thudding, and held my breath. Kept going, a step every few seconds. Would groaning under weight. It stopped after a minute. I figured maybe it was a deer, or the wind shifting the porch boards. Still, I couldn't sleep after that. The next morning, I saw footprints in the snow outside the front door. Human ones. Boot prints. They circled the cabin once and disappeared back into the woods. They weren't mine. I'd stayed inside all day. They were spaced far apart, like the person was tall or walking fast. I told myself it was probably a local hunter. Maybe someone checking out the place, thinking it was empty. The guy I rented from hadn't mentioned neighbors, but I hadn't asked either. Still, the sight of those tracks, fresh and clear, made the skin on my neck prickle. I spent the day chopping some of the drier wood I found at the bottom of the stack. I tried to distract myself with reading, cooking, and writing nonsense in my journal. But every sound outside made me twitch. The wind in the trees, branches falling, snow shifting on the roof. I didn't sleep that night either. The third night, something woke me again. This time it was a scrape, like metal on wood. Came from the back of the cabin, near the kitchen. I sat up on the couch, where I'd been dozing with the fire dying out. The sound came again. Scrape, pause, scrape. I crept into the kitchen and looked out the back window. Nothing but darkness and trees. In the morning, I found more tracks. This time, they led from the creek up to the back of the house. Someone had walked right up to the rear wall and just stood there. No boot prints leading away, just a set of them straight to the wall and nothing else. I tried to convince myself they'd been covered by snowfall, But I knew better. The snow was light, barely an inch. No way it erased footprints that quickly. That afternoon, I dragged an old dresser in front of the back door. I wedged a chair under the knob for good measure. I didn't own a gun, but I did have a hunting knife and a hammer, which I kept near me at all times after that. I didn't want to leave early. I told myself I was overreacting, but something felt wrong. It wasn't just the tracks. It was a feeling, like I was being watched. On the fourth night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat by the fire with the lights off, wrapped in a blanket, eyes on the windows. Around 3 a.m., I saw movement. Just a flicker, a shape moving past the front window. I froze, didn't breathe. A few seconds later, I heard a soft thud on the porch. Then that same creaking again. One step, pause, another step. Whoever it was stopped right in front of the door. Then silence. I sat there for what felt like an hour. Never moved, never blinked. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. In the morning, I found the snow on the porch disturbed, like someone had stood there a long time, shuffling their feet. The footprints led down the hill toward the trees. I followed them for about 50 feet before they disappeared into the underbrush. No sign of who made them. That day, I almost left. I packed my bag, threw everything into the car, and started it up. But the engine made a weird grinding noise and then died. I tried again. Nothing. Battery was fine. Fuel gauge said I had a quarter tank, but it wouldn't turn over. I popped the hood. Everything looked normal, but I'm no mechanic. I went back inside, heart sinking. I kept the fire going all day and tried not to panic. That night, I left the lights on. Every single one. I sat with the hammer in my lap, barely blinking. No movement, no sounds. But the next morning, I found something new. On the porch railing, someone had scratched a message into the wood. Just 2 words, "Stay inside." I stared at it for a long time. My hands were shaking. I knew I had to leave. I didn't care if I had to hike out. I packed everything into my bag and started walking down the road toward where I came from. But after a mile or so, I saw something that made me stop. My tire tracks, the ones I'd made driving in, were gone. Covered, but not by snow. Someone had raked the snow smooth, like they didn't want anyone to find the cabin. I turned back. I didn't know what else to do. I was in the middle of nowhere with no phone, no working car, no idea who was out there. I figured it'd be safer to stay inside during the day and only hike out once I had a solid plan. That night was the worst. Around midnight, I heard banging at the back door. Not knocking, banging. Like someone slamming their fists into the wood over and over. The chair wedged under the knob held, but the whole door shook. I grabbed the hammer and stood there, heart racing, not breathing. After a minute, the banging stopped. Then I heard footsteps running around the side of the cabin. I sprinted to the front door just in time to see someone disappear into the woods. Tall, wearing dark clothes, moving fast. I didn't sleep. I didn't even sit down. I waited for daylight, then moved the dresser away, grabbed my pack, and started walking again. This time I followed the creek downstream, thinking it might lead to a road. It took me half the day, but eventually I came out near a dirt road with tire tracks. Real ones, fresh. I followed them until I saw a mailbox and an old farmhouse. The man who lived there called the sheriff for me. He was quiet, looked at me strange when I told him where I'd been, said that cabin hadn't been rented out in years. Said the owner, a guy named Harrow, had died 2 winters ago. The sheriff came, asked me a few questions, then drove me back to the cabin to check things out. It was empty, no footprints, no scratches on the railing, nothing disturbed, but my car still wouldn't start. Sheriff had it towed to town. Turns out someone had pulled out a few spark plug wires. Deliberately, they never found who did it. I didn't stay the night in town. I rented a car and drove straight back to Boston. That was 8 years ago. I haven't gone camping since. Haven't stepped foot in Vermont either. I think about it a lot, who was out there, why they didn't break in, what they meant by stay inside. I don't have answers. Just the memory of a cold, I was 32 when it happened. and I still think about it more often than I'd like to admit. The memory always creeps back in when I'm alone in the woods or when I hear twigs snapping at night. It happened in early August 2019. I had taken a few weeks off work after finishing a long and stressful project. I needed a reset, no phone, no emails, no people. So I packed up my gear and drove up to a spot near Arrowhead Lake in Montana, a place I'd been to once before with a buddy 2 years earlier. It's not too popular, not too far off-grid, and there's a small Forest Service road that cuts through thick woods to a hidden clearing near the lake's edge. The road is bumpy, narrow, and barely maintained, but I liked that. Kept the crowds away. I planned to stay 4 nights. I had a big cooler of food, enough water, a good tent, tools, and my old 9mm pistol in the glove box, just in case. I wasn't expecting trouble. I just liked being prepared. I arrived around 4 p.m. that first day, set up my tent under the tall lodgepole pines, and spent the rest of the evening cooking a simple meal over the campfire. Everything felt calm. The woods were quiet, just the distant call of a hawk and the occasional rustle of small animals in the brush. That first night was peaceful. I slept hard, the way you do after a long drive and fresh air. But the next day, things started to feel off, though I didn't realize it until later. I woke early before sunrise. The morning air was cool and damp, the grass wet with dew. I made coffee on my little camp stove and took a walk down to the lake with my mug in hand. There was a low fog hugging the water, and the trees looked like shadows behind it. I didn't see anyone else, which was normal for this spot. You usually don't run into other campers unless it's the weekend. After breakfast, I decided to hike a few miles up one of the unmarked trails behind my campsite. I wanted to scout out a good spot for wildlife watching later in the evening. I carried my day pack with water, some granola bars, and my hunting knife. Not because I was hunting, but because a blade is always useful in the woods. About 2 miles in, I found a ridge that looked out over a small valley. Perfect spot. I marked it on my GPS and turned back. That's when I noticed something strange. A tree near the trail had been carved. Just a small mark, nothing dramatic, but it wasn't natural. It was a thin vertical line about eye level, and below it, a sideways X. It looked fresh. No moss growing in the cut. No weathering. It didn't seem like much at the time. People leave weird signs in the woods sometimes. Could be anything, a hiker marking their path, or even just a bored kid. I didn't give it more thought than that. I got back to camp by early afternoon, ate lunch, read a bit, then hiked back out to the ridge for sunset. It was beautiful. The sky lit up in oranges and purples, and the valley below turned to shadow. I waited until twilight, hoping to spot deer or maybe even a bear in the distance, but nothing came. By the time I got back to camp, it was nearly dark. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up. I couldn't figure out why at first. There were no strange noises, no light, nothing obvious. Just this tight feeling in my chest, like something was off. Around 2 a.m., I sat up and listened. Silence. No wind. No insects. Not even the distant hoot of an owl. The silence is what really got to me. Even in the woods, there's always some noise at night. Crickets, leaves rustling, something. But this was dead quiet, like the forest was holding its breath. I stayed up another hour just listening, my hand resting on my flashlight, my heart beating a little faster than I wanted to admit. Eventually, I laid back down and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I found something that made my skin crawl. Near the edge of the clearing where I'd parked my truck, maybe 30 feet from my tent, there were fresh footprints in the soft dirt. Human, adult-sized. They weren't mine. I checked. I wear size 12 boots, and these were smaller, probably a size 9 or 10. And barefoot. The prints came from the woods, stopped near my tent, and then turned around. Just a single set, like someone had walked up quietly, stood there for a while, then slipped back into the forest. I stared at them for a long time. Then I checked my tent, my truck, my gear. Everything was untouched. My food was still there. Nothing missing. I couldn't figure it out. If it was someone trying to steal, why leave empty-handed? Why barefoot? I thought about packing up and leaving. I really did. But I convinced myself it was probably just a weirdo hiker. Maybe high, maybe lost, maybe harmless. I didn't want to overreact. I had driven 6 hours to get here, and I still had 2 nights left. I moved my cooler and food into the truck, locked the doors, and kept my pistol on me the rest of the day. That evening, I didn't hike. I stayed in camp, fire burning bright, just sitting, listening. I thought maybe I imagined the footprints, or they were older than I realized. Maybe it wasn't a person at all. Maybe I just needed more sleep. That night was worse. I lay in my tent with my ears open. I didn't sleep. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard something outside. Not close at first, just footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching dry leaves, getting closer. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on inside the tent, but I didn't unzip the door. I just sat still, listening. The steps circled the tent. Once, then again, a full circle. They stopped near the back of the tent. Nothing for a full minute. Then the zipper of the tent moved. Didn't open, just moved like someone touched it, tested it. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. Then footsteps again, slowly walking away into the trees. I sat there, frozen. I don't know how long I waited. At least an hour, maybe more. I didn't hear anything else. When the sky finally started to lighten, I got up, got dressed, and walked the entire camp perimeter. No sign of anyone, no more footprints, just silence. That was it for me. I decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed everything fast, shoved gear into bags without folding or sorting, and loaded the truck. By 8 a.m., I was ready to go. I sat in the driver's seat, keys in hand, when I noticed something small tucked under my wiper blade. It was a single Polaroid photo, blurry, crooked, but I knew what it was. It was a photo of me sitting by the campfire, taken from behind the trees. I stared at it for a long time, my stomach twisting. My face was in profile, the firelight on my cheek. I must have been reading. The photo was taken from about 20 feet away, and I never heard a sound. I didn't wait another second. I started the truck and backed out onto the Forest Service road, tires kicking up dust. The road is rough, full of rocks and roots, and I was bouncing so much I thought my gear would fly out the back. I didn't care. I just wanted distance. The drive back to civilization felt like forever. I kept checking the rear view, half expecting someone to follow me. But no one did. I made it to the nearest gas station around noon. I didn't say anything to the guy inside. I just used the bathroom, bought a sandwich, and got back in the truck. When I got home, I looked at the photo again. There was something else in it. In the shadows, behind the trees, barely visible, was a second figure. Hard to see, just a shape, a silhouette. Could have been anything, but I knew. I filed a report with the sheriff's office, told them everything, gave them the photo. They took it seriously, sent someone out to check the area, but I never heard back. A month later, I called to follow up. They told me they didn't find anything. No signs of other camps, no prints, no trash, nothing. The ranger who went out said it looked undisturbed, like no one had been there at all. I still think about that place. I still wonder who was out there, what they wanted, why they watched me, why they took a photo, and why there were 2 of them. But more than anything, I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed one more night. It was the summer of 2017. I was 34 years old, working as a freelance photographer, mostly doing nature work. That year, I had taken on fewer assignments to make space for personal projects. One of those projects was to explore lesser-known camping spots in the western part of Colorado and photograph them in different lighting, sunrise, sunset, and under overcast skies. I had a decent 4x4 and a set of sturdy camping gear I'd built up over the years. I wasn't new to camping. I'd spent weeks alone in remote forests, on mountain trails, and even desert edges. I was confident in my skills: navigation, first aid, building fires, filtering water, you name it. I'd never had a real scare before, not even close. There was this area I'd been reading about online called Echo Valley. It wasn't in any big tourist guides. Just a handful of off-the-grid forums mentioned it. Supposedly, It was a forgotten trail near the western slope of the Uncompahgre Plateau, surrounded by steep hills, pine trees, and a creek that ran year-round. Some folks said it used to be a scout campsite back in the 80s, but after a bad flood, people stopped going. No one I personally knew had been there. That's what pulled me in. I planned a 3-day solo trip. I packed light but carefully: tent, sleeping bag, knife, bear spray, a .357 revolver I always brought on remote trips, portable stove, water purifier, satellite phone, and extra batteries. I loaded up my truck with food sealed in odor-proof bags and headed out on a Monday morning. It was early August, hot during the day, but the nights were cold up there. I reached the nearest service road by mid-afternoon, then drove another 40 minutes on a barely visible dirt path until I couldn't go further without risking damage to the truck. From there, it was a 2-hour hike into the woods. The path was overgrown but visible enough if you looked for broken branches or slight indentations in the grass. I followed the creek upstream as suggested in the forums. By the time I reached a decent flat area next to the creek, it was nearly 6 p.m. I set up camp fast, pitched the tent, gathered dry wood for a fire, and filtered water. There was a strange stillness in the air. The only sound was the water running over rocks and the occasional bird. No wind.
No insects buzzing.
Just quiet. I chalked it up to being deep in the valley, away from everything. That first night was uneventful. I made a small fire, heated up a can of chili, and sat with my back against a tree, watching the stars come out. Around 10 p.m., I turned in. The ground was firm but not too rocky. I slept well. The second day I spent exploring. I walked a couple of miles in each direction along the creek, taking photos and marking my path with biodegradable tape so I could find my way back. I noticed some old fire rings and metal stakes in the ground, signs people had camped here years ago. At one point, I found a rusted-out Coleman stove buried under leaves. That confirmed the scout camp theory. Around late afternoon, I hiked up a ridge on the north side of the valley to get a wide-angle photo of the area. That's when I saw something that made me stop. Across the valley, maybe half a mile away, near the tree line, I saw a glint, like light reflecting off glass or metal. It was brief, maybe half a second, but enough to catch my attention. I stared for a while, waiting to see it again, but nothing moved. I figured it could be an old beer bottle or maybe a deer moving through a sunbeam. I took a few photos and headed back down before the light disappeared. That night, after dinner, I sat by the fire again. The same stillness surrounded me. At one point, I thought I heard a soft cracking sound in the distance, like a branch snapping under weight, but it didn't repeat, and I've heard branches fall on their own plenty of times. Still, I kept the revolver closer to my sleeping bag than usual. I woke up sometime after midnight. I didn't know what exactly woke me, but my eyes shot open. My tent was closed, and everything was quiet. Too quiet. The creek sounded muffled, like something was dampening the air. I lay there for a minute, listening, holding my breath. Then I heard it again. A soft crunch, like footsteps on dry leaves, not too far from the tent. Now, footsteps in the woods don't always mean danger. Deer walk through camps. Raccoons snoop around. But these steps were slow and deliberate: step, pause, step, pause. I sat up slowly, grabbed the revolver, and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. I couldn't see anything. It was pitch black except for the moonlight filtering through the pines. The fire was out, just embers. I stayed like that for about 5 minutes, staring into the woods, heart pounding. Nothing moved. Eventually, the steps faded. I didn't hear them leave, just nothing again. I stayed awake until dawn, lying still, gun in hand, ears straining. As the sky lightened, birds returned, and the normal forest sounds came back. It was like whatever had been near was gone with the dark. I got up, made coffee, and checked the perimeter. No tracks, no broken branches, no sign of animals or people. I debated cutting the trip short, but stubbornness won out. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe just my nerves. Still, I didn't stray too far that third day. I stayed close to camp, kept the fire going, and spent more time watching than taking pictures. Around noon, I heard something faint in the distance. Sounded like metal clanging. Not loud, but out of place. I couldn't place the direction. It lasted maybe 2 seconds and stopped. No echo, no follow-up. I climbed back up the ridge that evening, hoping to catch the sunset and maybe figure out what I'd seen the day before. This time, I brought my telephoto lens. I scanned the tree line where I'd seen the glint. Nothing. But when I looked slightly west of that spot, I noticed something odd. A small structure barely visible between trees. It looked like wood, maybe a shed or an old cabin. I hadn't noticed it before, probably hidden by the angle or lighting. I zoomed in and snapped a few photos. The building looked weathered, almost collapsed in parts. But what really got me was a figure, a person, standing outside it, dressed in dark clothes, still as stone, facing the valley. I froze. The distance was too far to see details, but this wasn't a hunter. No orange vest, no gear, just a lone figure staring. I packed up fast and rushed down the ridge, heart racing. I didn't run. I didn't want to draw attention, but I moved fast. Back at camp, I didn't eat. I doused the fire early and climbed into the tent just before sunset. I kept the gun in my hand. I didn't sleep. All night I listened. I heard rustling a few times, faint sounds, too far to pinpoint. Once I thought I heard breathing outside the tent. Not loud, but close enough that I held my breath and didn't move for 10 minutes. By morning, I'd had enough. I packed everything up by 6 a.m., barely stopping to eat. I loaded my gear and began the hike back to the truck. I checked behind me every few minutes. My nerves were shredded. When I reached the truck and locked the doors, I sat there for 5 minutes, just breathing. I started the engine and took off down the dirt road, only slowing when I hit pavement again. I drove straight to the nearest town, Montrose, checked into a cheap motel and showered for an hour. Later that night, I looked through the photos I'd taken. The structure was clearer in one of the shots. Definitely a shed or one-room cabin. The figure, though, it was gone. In the photo, there was no one there, just trees. I could have sworn I saw someone. I stared at it for hours, zoomed in, changed contrast, brightness, nothing. I reported the cabin to the ranger station the next day, told them I thought someone might be squatting out there and acting strangely. They said they'd look into it. I never heard back. I never went back to Echo Valley. I still go camping, but I stick to known areas now, trails with other people nearby. That trip changed something in me. It wasn't fear of animals or getting lost. It was the silence, the way the air felt wrong, the way someone or something moved through those woods without making a sound when it wanted to. I don't believe in ghosts or monsters. I believe in people, and I think someone was watching me out there. Maybe they lived there. Maybe they didn't like visitors. Maybe they were just waiting to see what I'd do. I didn't stay long enough to find out, and I never will. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months. Something about the quiet of nature, the simplicity of just being alone with my thoughts, appealed to me. My name is Thomas, and at 29 years old, I'd gone on a few solo trips in the past, but nothing quite like this. It was late October, and the air had started to cool as the day ended. I was camping in the remote wilderness of the Rocky Mountains, just outside a small town in Colorado. There wasn't much around, just miles of untouched forest and the occasional trail. Perfect for solitude. I'd set up camp earlier that day, near a small creek. It was the kind of spot you dream about when you think of camping. Beautiful views, the sound of running water nearby, and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. My tent was pitched neatly, and my campfire crackled as I sat in front of it, preparing some food for the evening. I didn't have a whole lot, just a small portable stove, some dried meals, and a couple of cans of beans. As night fell, the forest seemed to grow quieter, the sounds of the birds and animals that were so present during the day fading into a soft hush. Only the crackling of the fire and the occasional splash of water from the creek broke the silence. It was peaceful, too peaceful almost, but I didn't think much of it. After finishing my meal, I decided to explore a bit, not straying too far from camp. The air was crisp, the ground damp with the remnants of the day's moisture. My boots crunched the fallen leaves beneath me as I walked along the creek, watching the water meander through the rocks. The trees around me were tall and imposing, their branches swaying in the wind. It was a scene right out of a painting, yet something about the stillness felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought I was. I laughed it off at first. After all, I was in the middle of a national forest. Of course, there would be wildlife, bears, mountain lions, deer. I had read about these dangers before coming out here, but I figured I had nothing to worry about. I wasn't near any bear dens or known mountain lion habitats. Still, as I walked along the creek, I felt eyes on me. Maybe it was the sound of my footsteps amplifying in the silence, or maybe it was just my imagination running wild. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was watching me. As the minutes passed, I began to feel uneasy. The forest, usually so serene, felt claustrophobic. The trees seemed taller, the darkness deeper. I turned around and made my way back to camp quickly, brushing off the creeping paranoia that was beginning to settle in. When I arrived back at my tent, the fire was still burning, but the warmth from it seemed to have dimmed somehow. I fed more wood into the flames and sat down again, hoping the fire's crackling would calm my nerves. The night was now fully upon me, and the temperature had dropped considerably. I pulled on a jacket and zipped myself into my sleeping bag, trying to ignore the chill in the air. But as I lay there, staring up at the roof of the tent, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The wind outside had picked up, and the branches of the trees creaked and groaned in the gusts. Every little sound seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. Hours passed in a restless half-sleep, my mind constantly drifting between wakefulness and dreams. The wind outside howled, the tent shaking lightly with each gust. I had just started to doze off when I heard it, a faint noise just barely audible over the wind. At first, I thought it was the sound of a large animal moving through the forest. Maybe a deer, maybe a bear. But it wasn't the rustling I had expected. This was different. It was almost like the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. I held my breath, straining to hear. There it was again, a soft, shuffling noise, like someone walking through the underbrush. My heart began to race, and I found myself holding my breath. I could hear the crunch of leaves, the snapping of twigs underfoot. Whoever or whatever was out there was moving slowly, purposefully, as if they were aware of my presence. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent, and for a long moment, everything was silent. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I wasn't sure what to do. The idea of going out there to check was absurd. If it was an animal, I didn't want to risk startling it. But if it was a person, that thought sent a chill through me. I had read stories about people who went missing in the wild, never to be seen again. And now, alone in the dark forest, I wondered if I might be next. The minutes dragged on, the silence deafening. I waited, barely moving, listening for any sign of activity. The footsteps, if that's what they had been, didn't come back. Maybe I had imagined them, I thought. My nerves had been shot all day, and I had probably just been hearing things. But that didn't explain the faint scraping sound I heard next. A sound like something, or someone, was dragging something heavy along the forest floor. The sound was distant, but it was there. I slowly unzipped my tent just enough to peek out, but I didn't see anything. No movement, no sign of life. I stared into the dark forest, the firelight casting long, distorted shadows on the trees. Nothing. I didn't sleep at all that night. I spent the rest of the hours listening to every crack and groan the forest made, eyes darting to every shadow, convinced something was out there. By morning, I was exhausted, my eyes heavy with lack of sleep. But as I packed up my things and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The sensation of being watched persisted, even as I made my way back to the car. When I reached the trailhead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A set of large footprints, deep and unmistakable, led right up to the edge of the trail, just where I had camped. They weren't from an animal. They were human. I quickly got into my car and drove away, never looking back. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back to that part of the forest again. I was 29 when I went on that camping trip in late October of 2018. I still think about it more than I want to. I try not to talk about it much. The people I told either don't believe me or say I was just scared and paranoid. But I know what I saw, and more importantly, I know what I felt. I grew up hiking. My dad was one of those serious outdoorsmen, maps, compass, knot tying lessons, the whole deal. He raised me on it, and I learned to love being out in the woods. Camping was always something that brought me peace. So that fall, when things in my life were getting loud and fast, work stress, breakup, rent going up, I decided to take a weekend to just disappear into the quiet. I picked a lesser-known spot in Tennessee, about 2 hours outside of Nashville. It was called Kettle Ridge Forest Reserve. Not a state park, just a stretch of protected land with a few barely used trails. I found it online through a forum for off-the-grid hiking and looked it up on Google Maps. There weren't even official campsites, which I liked. No other campers, just trees and hills and whatever I brought in with me. I packed light but smart: sleeping bag, tent, food for 3 days, water, a small filter, tools, a flashlight, extra batteries, a flare gun, and my phone with 2 battery packs. No cell signal, but I brought it for the GPS. I didn't tell many people where I was going, just one coworker, Sarah. I gave her the area and said if she didn't hear from me by Monday, call someone. That was my safety net. The first day was normal. I got to the makeshift parking area near the old forestry gate around 10:30 a.m. The hike into the woods was a little rough. Uneven trail, fallen trees, thick underbrush. It had rained earlier that week, so the ground was still damp, and my boots sank in the mud a few times. But it was quiet, and I liked that. No cars, no people. Just wind through the trees and the occasional squirrel. I hiked about 4 miles in before I found a decent spot. A flat patch on a hill with a view of the ridge and a shallow stream below. I pitched my tent, unpacked, and set up a small fire ring with some stones. I didn't plan to make a huge fire, just enough for warmth and cooking. That evening, I boiled some rice and beans, drank tea, and sat in my camp chair as the sun set. Everything felt calm until around 2 a.m. I had just started drifting off in my sleeping bag when I heard something crunch outside. Not wind, not leaves falling. Something heavy, something stepping. I froze. I lay there completely still, holding my breath. I listened harder. One step, then another. Slow, steady, deliberate. Deer, I thought, or maybe a bear. But bears don't usually walk that quietly. I reached for my flashlight without turning it on and just held it. I didn't unzip the tent or make a sound. The steps kept coming closer, then stopped. Right outside. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, everything looked normal. I got out and checked around the tent. No clear tracks, the ground was still too wet, and the leaves covered most of it. Nothing was moved or missing. Still, I felt off. That whole day, I kept looking over my shoulder while I hiked around to explore. I followed the stream down to a patch of rocks and filtered some water. Ate lunch. Climbed a ridge to get a better view of the area. That's when I saw it. A small clearing deeper into the woods, maybe half a mile east of my camp. It didn't look natural. Trees don't just grow in perfect circles like that, and the way the grass was matted down in the middle, it looked used. I wasn't sure what for, but I knew I didn't like it. I had this crawling feeling in my stomach. Still, curiosity pushed me toward it. I went back to camp, dropped off my pack, and walked to the clearing with just my knife and flashlight. The woods were thicker on that side. More thorns, more dead branches. I had to fight through some of it just to get there. When I reached the clearing, the silence hit me harder than I expected. No wind.
No birds.
Not even bugs. Just quiet, and the crunch of my boots on dead leaves. In the center of the clearing, there was an old fire pit, blackened stones and some half-burnt wood. Around it were things, weird things, a broken folding chair, a torn piece of blue tarp, a rusted coffee can, and near the edge of the clearing, a tree with something nailed to it. Piece of wood, like a sign but blank. The place smelled faintly like old smoke and mold. I backed away and didn't go back. That night was worse. I built a bigger fire and kept it going longer, hoping that maybe animals or whatever would stay away. I sat in my chair with my flashlight across my lap and watched the trees. Around 11, I started to hear something again. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was like branches snapping in the distance. Not just one or two, repeated, slow, like someone walking through thick brush. But not toward me, just moving nearby. I turned off my headlamp and sat in the dark, waiting. The snapping went on for maybe 10 minutes, then stopped. I couldn't tell where it came from exactly, just that it was close enough to hear but far enough that I couldn't see anything. I stayed up until 3 a.m. again, then finally passed out from exhaustion. In the morning, I found something new. At the back of my camp, maybe 20 feet from my tent, there was a small pile of rocks, neatly stacked, maybe 8 or 9 of them. I hadn't put them there. I didn't build it. I don't even remember seeing those rocks before. It wasn't natural either. The rocks were too round and clean. It looked placed, like someone built it on purpose. That was it. I decided to leave. I packed everything up quickly and started hiking out by 9 a.m. My legs were sore from barely sleeping, and my brain was spinning with possibilities. Was someone messing with me? Was it some weird backwoods camper or hunter? I didn't want to find out, but the hike out wasn't smooth. About 2 miles in, I realized the trail looked different. I had marked trees with a blade on my way in, just little notches to follow out, but the marks were gone. At first, I thought I missed them, so I backtracked a bit, but they weren't there. I went another half mile, and that's when I noticed a second pile of rocks off the trail. Same size, same shape, and it was fresh. Damp leaves underneath it, like it had just been built. Now I was panicking. I tried using my GPS, but the app wouldn't load. No signal. The compass still worked, so I used that to guess my way west, toward the parking area. I moved fast, didn't stop for water. I just wanted to get out. I hiked for maybe 4 hours, but the woods kept repeating. Same thick brush, same fallen logs. I saw a tree with a large, smooth gash in the bark, and 30 minutes later, I saw it again. Same exact cut. I was looping without knowing it. Around 3 p.m., I saw smoke. It was faint, but rising between the trees maybe 200 yards away. I thought it might be another camper or maybe even a ranger station, so I moved toward it. But it wasn't a campsite. It was the clearing. Same exact one. Same broken chair. Same nailed wood. The fire pit was burning again. I swear on my life, I hadn't gone in a circle that big. There's no way I should have been back there. I never turned around. I just kept walking west. That fire wasn't lit earlier. Someone had been there. Recently. Maybe still there. I didn't go in. I turned and ran. For the next hour, I didn't think. I just moved. I ran, walked, tripped, and pushed through branches. My legs were cut up, my hands bleeding, and my chest tight. I finally hit the stream again, the one near my original camp. That's when I realized I had gone backwards. I was sweating, cold, and shaking. I followed the stream downstream, praying it would lead me back toward the parking area eventually. That's when I saw something that made me stop cold. A man's jacket, hanging from a tree branch, faded orange, dirty, and below it the remains of a small camp. Just scraps, shredded tent fabric, a metal mug, bones, animal bones, I hoped, but I didn't check. I kept moving. By some miracle, I made it back to the parking area right before dark. My car was untouched. I got in, locked the doors, and didn't stop driving until I hit a gas station an hour away. I looked back once before I left. Just once. I thought I saw someone standing in the trees at the edge of the lot. Too far to see clearly. Could have been a branch. Could have been nothing. But I didn't go back to check. I filed a report a week later with the local sheriff's office. I didn't mention everything, just the signs of someone in the woods, the bones, and the fact that I got lost off trail. The deputy I spoke to said people get turned around in those woods all the time. Old logging trails can confuse folks, he said. They never found that clearing. They never found the rocks. They never found the fire pit. Or maybe they didn't look hard enough. I haven't camped since then. I still hike sometimes on marked trails close to towns. But I always leave before dark. And I never go alone. Because I know what it feels like when you're not alone in the woods. And I never want to feel that again. I always loved getting away from everything, just shutting out the world for a few days. That was why I rented a cabin deep in the woods, far from any town, far from people, far from anything. It was supposed to be peaceful, a way to relax and disconnect. But looking back, I wish I had never gone there. The cabin was old but solid. It was a one-room structure with a small kitchen, a fireplace, and a bed pushed against the far wall. The wooden floors creaked under my boots when I stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of dust and wood smoke. There was no electricity, just a few old gas lamps hanging from the walls. It was exactly what I was looking for. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked my gear, set up a small fire outside, and made some food. The quiet was almost too much at first. No cars, no voices, just the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of an animal in the underbrush. I spent the evening sitting by the fire, eating, watching the sky darken. When the cold started creeping in, I went inside, locked the door, and settled in for the night. I woke up in the middle of the night. Something felt off. I wasn't sure what had woken me, but the air inside the cabin felt different, heavier somehow. I listened for a while, but all I could hear was the wind outside. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I went outside and walked around the cabin. That's when I saw them. Footprints in the dirt, circling the cabin. They were deep, heavy prints, not the light tracks of an animal. Someone had been there, walking around while I slept. I felt a chill run through me. I wasn't alone out here. I spent the rest of the day on edge. I kept checking the tree line, expecting to see someone watching me, but there was no one. I tried to push the fear down, telling myself it was probably just some hunter passing through. Maybe they saw the cabin and got curious. That was possible, right? That night, I locked the door and set a chair against it. I kept my knife next to me, barely sleeping. Every little noise made me jump. The wind against the windows, the crackling of cooling wood. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then, around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest. I gripped my knife, staying as still as possible. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I could hear breathing, slow and steady. Whoever was out there was standing just on the other side of the wood. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just waited. Minutes passed. Then, just as silently as they had come, the footsteps moved away. I listened until I couldn't hear them anymore. When the sun came up, I packed my things and left without looking back. I never found out who was out there that night. I never went back to that cabin. Some places are meant to be left alone. I had been planning the trip for weeks. I needed a break from everything. Work, city life, the constant hum of traffic outside my apartment window. I found a secluded camping spot deep in the national forest, far from any popular trails. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing near a small river that I had found on an old map. It seemed perfect. No people, no noise, just the woods and me. The drive took most of the afternoon. I followed a dirt road that eventually turned into an overgrown path. I parked my truck at the side and hiked the rest of the way in. The air smelled fresh, a mix of pine and damp earth. Leaves crunched under my boots as I pushed through thick brush, carrying my pack and gear. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was dipping low. I set up my tent near the tree line, close enough to the river to hear the water, but far enough away that I wouldn't wake up soaked in morning mist. After getting a small fire going, I cooked a simple meal, just some canned beans and beef jerky. The quiet was comforting. I had missed this feeling of being alone in nature, away from everything. As night fell, the forest came alive with sounds. The chirping of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush. I wasn't worried. I had camped alone before. I knew the noises of the forest. Around midnight, I woke up. First, I wasn't sure why. Then I heard it, a soft crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart started pounding. I lay still, listening. The steps were slow, deliberate, Too heavy for a small animal, but too light for a bear. I reached for my flashlight and flicked it on, aiming the beam outside my tent. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I listened for a while longer, but the sound was gone. Probably just a deer, I told myself. I zipped my sleeping bag up tighter and forced myself to relax. The next morning, I checked around my campsite. No tracks, no signs of anything unusual. Maybe I had imagined it, half asleep in the middle of the night. I shook it off and spent the day hiking, exploring the area, collecting firewood. By sunset, I was tired but content. I made another fire, ate dinner, and sat by the flames, staring into the darkness beyond the trees. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time. I turned quickly, my flashlight cutting through the night. Still nothing. I stood up, scanning the tree line. My skin prickled. Someone was out there, watching. I grabbed the hatchet from my pack and kept it close as I crawled into my tent. Sleep didn't come easy. Every little noise had me wide awake, gripping the handle of my hatchet. Hours passed. Then, just before dawn, I heard something that turned my blood cold. A deep, steady breathing, just outside my tent. I held my breath, my mind racing. I didn't move, didn't even blink. Whoever or whatever was out there stood just inches from the thin fabric separating us. Then silence. After what felt like an eternity, I heard slow footsteps retreating into the woods. I waited until the sun came up before unzipping my tent. My hands were shaking. I stepped outside and scanned the area. No footprints, no signs of anyone being there. I packed up as fast as I could, stuffing my gear into my pack, my heart still hammering. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. I hiked back to my truck, every snap of a twig making me jump. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my pack into the back and locked the doors as soon as I got inside. I sat there for a while, gripping the steering wheel, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. Then I started the engine and drove. I didn't stop until I was miles away. Even then, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone following me. I still don't know what was out there that night. Maybe just some stranger messing with me. Maybe something worse. But one thing is certain, I won't be camping alone again. I remember the trip like it was yesterday. The plan was simple. Take a few days off, drive out to a secluded camping spot in the mountains, and disconnect from everything. I wanted solitude. No work, no noise, no phone calls. Just me, the trees, and the open sky. I had picked a location that wasn't on the usual camping maps, a place I had found on an old hiking forum. The directions were vague, but that was part of the appeal. I wanted to be alone, away from crowded campsites and busy trails. I packed my gear carefully, making sure I had everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a few essentials. The drive took longer than I expected. The paved road eventually gave way to a dirt path, and soon I was navigating rocky terrain with no clear signs. My truck bounced along the uneven ground as I followed the GPS coordinates. There were no tire tracks, no signs of recent visitors. That made me feel even better. I wanted isolation, and I had found it. The sun was already dipping below the treetops when I finally reached a small clearing near a river. It was perfect. Flat ground, a water source, and no sign of human activity. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and started a small fire. As darkness settled in, the silence was overwhelming. No cars, no distant hum of civilization, just the occasional rustling of leaves and the chirping of insects. I ate my dinner by the fire, enjoying the crisp mountain air. Everything felt peaceful. I stayed up for a while, staring at the flames, listening to the night. Eventually, I climbed into my tent and zipped it up. The fabric felt thin against the vast wilderness, but I was used to camping alone. I wasn't worried. Sometime in the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The fire outside had died down to embers, and everything was pitch black. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not an animal's quick, scurrying steps. These were slow and deliberate. My mind raced. I had seen no other people on the way here, no vehicles, no campsites. Who else would be out here? I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped. I waited, straining my ears. Nothing. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I had dreamed it. I tried to go back to sleep. Morning came, and I stepped out of my tent, stretching. The forest was peaceful again, the river flowing nearby. But something was off. My gear had been moved. Not much, just small things. My flashlight, which I had placed beside me before sleeping, was now near the fire pit. My backpack was unzipped, though nothing seemed to be missing. I felt uneasy but tried to shake it off. Maybe I had just been careless. Maybe I had knocked things around in my sleep. I told myself not to overthink it. I spent the day exploring. I hiked along the river, took some photos, and enjoyed the quiet. By the time I returned, the sun was already lowering again. I started another fire and cooked a simple meal. As the night deepened, that eerie feeling returned. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the darkness. It was that strange sense of being watched, the same feeling I'd had since waking up. I reassured myself that it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. But I made sure to keep my flashlight within reach as I climbed into my tent. I barely slept. Every little sound jolted me awake. At one point, I thought I heard whispering. Faint, almost like the wind, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. I sat up, gripping my knife, listening. The whispering stopped. Then came the footsteps again. This time, they were closer. I held my breath. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then silence. Whoever or whatever was out there was standing still, just waiting. I wanted to look outside, to shine my light and see, but fear kept me frozen. I couldn't move. I didn't want to know. Minutes passed. Then, finally, the footsteps moved away. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn. When I stepped outside, my stomach dropped. There were footprints, bare human footprints circling my tent. My firewood was scattered. My gear had been moved again. But the worst part was what I found hanging from a tree branch nearby. A small bundle of sticks, tied together with twine, in the shape of a person. I didn't waste time. I packed up as fast as I could, stuffing my tent and supplies into my truck. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I just wanted to leave. As I started the engine, I glanced back one last time. That's when I saw it. Deep in the trees just beyond the clearing. A figure, standing still, watching me. I didn't wait to see more. I slammed the truck into gear and drove, bouncing over the rough trail, not stopping until I reached the main road. Only then did I let myself breathe. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. Maybe it was some hermit living off the grid. Maybe it was something worse. I never went back to find out.